Section 16 of Shout Treason. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Shout Treason, The Trial of Aaron Burr by Francis F. Beirne. Chapter 16. On the day following the postponement of his arraignment, Harmon Blennerhassett received an important visitor in his quarters in the penitentiary. He was William Duane, formerly a partner of Benjamin Franklin and Edward Bosch in the publication of the Aurora. Duane was now the fiery editor of that newspaper, which he had made into an organ of the Jeffersonian administration. Duane expressed great sympathy for Blennerhassett. He told him his friends were making a scapegoat of him. Then, according to Blennerhassett, Duane tried to lure him into a confession of having written certain papers then in the hands of the prosecution. But the chief purpose of his visit was to try to persuade Blennerhassett to betray Burr. This Blennerhassett steadfastly refused to do, and that was strange, since he was himself convinced that, as Duane charged, he had been made a scapegoat. Less than a week after Duane's visit, he posted in his diary, "You were right, therefore, honest Hay, on observing the other day to Woolbridge while expressing your concern for my situation, that I must now think Burr has duped me. But you were wrong in supposing I am indebted to you for that discovery. I am possessed of it these 9 months." Burr, who had his informants everywhere, was immediately apprised of Duane's visit and lost no time getting word to Blennerhassett to be on his guard against spies who came to him under the mask of friendship. This precaution was unnecessary. Whatever Blennerhassett may have confided in his diary, he was always completely disarmed when he came into the presence of Burr, and even when they were apart, he seemed still to feel Burr's influence. Blennerhassett's determination not to turn state's evidence against the man who had duped him after pretending to be his friend has been attributed to the mildness of his temper or lack of courage. Perhaps each was a factor. However, Blennerhassett was not a bright man. His romance with his niece is evidence of an impetuosity that led him to act without counting the cost. From the time of their first meeting, Burr had courted him assiduously, protesting that his vegetating on the island was a fraud on society and holding out brilliant prospects. Blennerhassett would have been easy prey for an even less skillful flatterer. What chance did he have with a man who had duped some of the best minds in the country, and once, through oratory alone, had provoked the Senate of the United States to adoration and tears? When court convened on Monday morning, McRae opened for the prosecution and proceeded to live up to his reputation for wielding a meat-axe. He was not the least restrained by the consciousness that his remarks were being made in the presence of, and only a few feet away from, Aaron Burr. The prisoner, he charged, had with unexampled dexterity contrived from the very beginning to quit his situation as the accused. Instead of Aaron Burr defending himself, he was found taking the high ground of public accuser and assailing others. Mr. McRae charged that Wilkinson, whom he called the savior of his country, and who had prevented the execution of this detestable plot, had incurred the hatred and resentment of the prisoner and his associates in proportion as he deserved well of his fellow citizens. Let others question General Wilkinson's integrity. Mr. McRae would not do so, at least not in open court. In McRae's language, Wilkinson was the patriotic and meritorious officer like those who opposed and overthrew Catiline, the Roman conspirator, who defeated this daring scheme against American liberty. He would not be forgiven by the conspirators. If he, Burr, be innocent and pure as the child unborn, sneered Mr. MacRae, if he knew nothing of the transaction, why is it that this motion is made to exclude evidence? What though the prisoner was not on Blennerhassett Island when the overt act was committed? The speaker contended that nevertheless he was guilty if anybody was guilty. Is there, he asked, any human being who, having heard the evidence of General Eaton, the evidence of the Messrs. Morgan, and the evidence of the witnesses who speak of the overt act on the island, especially Jacob Albright and Peter Taylor, who can doubt his guilt? Mr. MacRae professed he could not see why it should be necessary for Colonel Burr to be on the island if he enlisted the men and sent them to the place, and acted himself in another place. Nor would he bring up the cases of Lady Lisle and Elizabeth Gaunt, who had been mentioned by Mr. Whitcomb. Why should he? These women were accessories after the fact. But Mr. Burr had never been regarded as an accessory. He was the first mover of the plot. He planned it, he matured it, he contrived the doing of the overt acts which others did. Burr, charged MacRae, was the alpha and omega of this treasonable scheme, the very body and soul, the very life of this treason. So, observed Mr. MacRae, Mr. Wickham had said the prosecution must prove that the accused was personally present. No, sir, he objected. It is necessary to prove that some act laid has been committed. If the law pronounced that he is liable for the acts of his agents, and if the fact be that his agents by his commands and at his request committed the act, where is the necessity of producing proof that he was on the spot himself? Counsel for defense had complained of construction. Our construction we think correct, said Mr. MacRae, because it is calculated to secure the rights of the citizen and to render the government permanent. Whereas if the construction of the gentleman on the other side be correct, the government cannot be permanent. Let them have the power of ubiquity. The conspirators will always contrive to avail themselves of this plea that they were not present. Mr. MacRae turned to the Old Testament to support his argument. He used the story of David and Uriah to illustrate it, confident that it was well known to all the members of the jury in an age when everybody read the Bible. David, he recalled, placed Uriah in the front of the battle in opposition to a very powerful opponent in order that he might be slain and that David might afterwards take his wife. If people were asked who killed Uriah, David or the antagonist by whose sword Uriah fell, the answer of all would be that, having placed him in the front of the battle in a place of the greatest danger, in immediate opposition to a man of great strength and power, with the intention that he should be killed, David killed him. The speaker now applied the principle to the case before the court. We suppose the prisoner, by himself and agents, to have been acting at or about the same time at Beaver, Kentucky, and Blennerhassett's Island. We suppose that the prisoner enlisted men before he came to Beaver and at it. We suppose that afterwards his men proceeded by his orders to Blennerhassett's Island, and were there increasing their numbers by more enlistments, and providing the means of transporting his troops down the river towards the scene of his expedition, while he was himself enlisting more men in Kentucky and making arrangements preparatory to his meeting and assuming the command of the whole at the mouth of the Cumberland. And that, in fact, pursuant to this plan of operations, he did meet and take the command of all the conspirators at the latter place. Were there precedents in the law to sustain this argument? Mr. McRae cited the case mentioned in Hale's Pleas of the Crown, of the Lord Decra, and divers others who came to steal deer in the park of one Pelham. Raydon, one of the company, killed the keeper of the park, the Lord Decra and the rest of the company being in other parts of the park. Yet it was held that it was murder in them all, and they died for it. And, said Mr. McRae, there was American authority too. He cited Dallas's reports and the case of the United States against Mitchell in the Whiskey Rebellion, in which Judge Patterson's charge to the jury showed that a man did not have to be present at the overt act. Mr. McRae then took his fling at the Chief Justice's opinion in the Bowman and Swartwout case. So the defense considered that it was not a regular, solemn opinion, that it was not delivered on a point depending before the judges, but extrajudicial and therefore not authority. Why, declared Mr. McRae, the language was so explicit and pointed that it could not possibly be misunderstood. I consider it as completely proved by the opinion, he continued, that if an unlawful assemblage of men meet together for a treasonable purpose, it is not necessary that arms should be in the hands of those who are concerned in order to make them traitors. I have imagined that their meeting together in this manner, in military array, would be sufficient to show that their purpose was treasonable. The speaker considered also that the reason of East on the subject was conclusive where, among other things, he held that any assembly of persons met for a treasonable purpose, armed and arrayed in a warlike manner, is bellum levatum, though not percussum. On that note, Mr. McRae ended his argument. Bellum levatum, though not percussum. That theme, with variations, was to get exhaustive treatment from the next speaker, but the court had heard enough for one day. When, on the morning of the 25th, the bailiff called for order, the dashing 34-year-old William Wirt entered the lists as champion for the prosecution. Critics of the administration complained bitterly of President Jefferson using the public money to employ private counsel when there were official prosecutors on the payroll for the purpose of performing that particular task. But the president felt he could not leave so great a responsibility to the plodding Hay, especially after the defense had assembled such a dazzling array of counsel. On this hot August morning the time had come for Wirt to prove to the public that the fee he would receive from the government was well earned. Wirt was faced with a dilemma. At this phase of his career, his chief asset was a natural flow of words that was surpassed only by that of James Wilkinson. While eloquence might be counted on to sway a jury, its effect on the Chief Justice was highly problematical. Judge Marshall's style was logical and free from embellishments. He also had a keen sense of the ridiculous. Thus, as Wirt warmed to his task and instinctively soared to rhetorical heights, he found himself being rudely brought down to earth out of anxiety over what mischievous thoughts lay behind the solemn countenance of the Chief Justice. The speaker commenced his dissertation by undertaking to clear himself of personal malice toward the accused. The humanity and justice of the nation, he observed, would revolt at the idea of a prosecution pushed on against a life which stood protected by the laws. I would not, he declared, plant a thorn to rankle for life in my heart by opening my lips in support of a prosecution which I felt and believed to be unjust. Mr. Wirt noted that the gentlemen of the defense appeared to feel a very extraordinary and unreasonable degree of sensibility on this occasion. They seemed to forget the nature of the charge and that he and his colleagues were the prosecutors. But the lawyers of the prosecution did not stand there to pronounce a panegyric on the prisoner. They were there to urge on him the crime of treason against his country. The lawyers of the prosecution, Mr. Wirt warned, were not going to mince matters. When they spoke of treason, they must call it treason. When they spoke of a traitor, they must call him a traitor. When they spoke of a plot to dismember the Union, to undermine the liberties of a great portion of the people of this country, and subject them to a usurper and a despot, they were obliged to use the terms that conveyed those ideas. Why, then, were the gentlemen of the defense so sensitive? Why, on those occasions so necessary, so unavoidable, did they shrink back with so much agony of nerve, as if instead of being in a hall of justice, they were in a drawing-room with Colonel Burr, and were barbarously violating towards him every principle of decorum and humanity? The speaker then proceeded to deal facetiously with Wickham's erudition. The latter, he reminded, had invited them to consider the subject abstractly. But would there not be danger in that, while they were mooting points, pursuing ingenious hypotheses, chasing elementary principles over the wide extended plains and alpine heights of abstracted law, was there not danger that they would lose sight of the great question before the court? The motion before the court, Mr. Wirt agreed, was a bold and original stroke in the noble science of defense. It marked the genius and hand of a master, for, said he, it gave the prisoner every possible advantage. Yet at the same time it cut off from the prosecution all the evidence which went to connect the prisoner with the assemblage on the island, to explain the destination and objects of the assemblage, and to stamp beyond controversy the character of treason upon it. If, asked Mr. Wirt, the views of the prisoner were, as they had been so often represented by one of his counsel, highly honorable to himself and glorious to his country, why not permit the evidence to disclose those views? No, sir, he protested. It is not squeamish modesty, it is no fastidious delicacy that prompts these repeated efforts to keep back the evidence. It is apprehension, it is alarm, it is fear, or rather the certainty that the evidence, whenever it shall come forward, will fix the charge. And now Mr. Wirt, with the instinct of a good showman, was reminded that he was speaking to an audience of men, and must season his discourse with a little spice. I will not, he asserted, follow the example which he, Mr. Wickham, has set me on a very recent occasion. I will not, like him, in reply to an argument as naked as a sleeping Venus, but certainly not half so beautiful, complain on the painful necessity I am under, in the weakness and decrepitude of logical vigor, of lifting first this flounce and then that furbelow, before I can reach the wished-for point of attack. Mr. Wirt's metaphor must at least have provoked smiles from the audience, if not downright laughter. On the contrary, said Mr. Wirt, he would endeavor to meet the gentlemen's propositions in their full force and to answer them fairly. He would not, as Mr. Wickham had done, as he was advancing toward them with his mind's eye, measure the height, breadth, and power of the proposition. If he found it beyond his strength, halve it. If it still was beyond his strength, quarter it. If still necessary, subdivide it into eighths. And when, by this process, he had reduced it to the proper standard, take one of those sections and toss it with an air of elephantine strength and superiority. Mr. Wirt would not, in commenting on the gentlemen's authorities, thank the gentlemen with sarcastic politeness for introducing them, declare that they conclude directly against him, read just so much of the authority as serves the purpose of that declaration, omitting that which contained the true point of the case which was made against him. Nor, if forced by a direct call to read that part also, would he content himself with running over it as rapidly and inarticulately as he could, throw down the book with a theatrical air, and exclaim, just as I said, when he knew it was just as he had not said. Having thus performed this little exercise in satire at Mr. Wickham's expense, Mr. Wirt got down to the case in point. He noted that Mr. Wickham had read the constitutional definition of treason and given the rule by which it was to be interpreted. After he had done that, it would have been natural for him to proceed directly to apply that rule to the definition and give the result. But no. Even while they had their eyes on the gentleman, he vanished like a spirit from American ground and was seen no more until he turned up in England, resurging by a kind of intellectual magic in the middle of the 16th century, complaining most dolefully of my Lord Coke's bowels. Before we follow him in this excursion, proposed the speaker, it may be well to inquire what it was that induced him to leave the regular track of his argument. I will tell you what it was. It was, sir, the decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Beirne and Swartwout. Sir, if the gentleman had believed this decision to be favorable to him, we should have heard of it in the beginning of his argument. And so the prosecution was back again, lunging at the chink in the defense's armor which the Chief Justice, in one rare moment of careless workmanship, had left there. What said the Supreme Court? Mr. Wirt read the offending passage. If a body of men be assembled for the purpose of effecting by force a treasonable purpose, all those who perform any part, however minute or however remote from the scene of action, and who are actually leaguered in the general conspiracy, are to be considered as traitors. The constant reiteration of his error must have brought a blush to the tanned cheek of the Chief Justice, or had constant repetition by now rendered him immune to embarrassment. Counsel for the defense, said Mr. Wirt, had taken the bold and difficult ground that the passage which he had read was extrajudicial, a mere obiter dictum. They were, he insisted, mistaken. It was a direct adjudication of a point immediately before the court. The speaker referred to the fact that Judge Marshall had been asked by the defense to disregard the Beirne-Swartwout decision. But, he asked, how could an inferior court control the decision of the superior court? If the Chief Justice, sitting as a circuit court, had the right to disregard the rule decided by the Supreme Court and to adopt a different rule, then every other inferior court had a right to do the same. Then there would be as many various rules as to treason as there were courts. The result, Mr. Wirt insisted, might be, and certainly would be, that what would be treason in one circuit would not be treason in another, and a man might be hanged in Pennsylvania for an act against the United States of which he would be perfectly innocent in Virginia. And, continued Mr. Wirt, if treason requires the actual presence at the scene of the assemblage, how easy it would be for the principal traitor to avoid this guilt and escape punishment forever. He might go into distant states, and from one state to another. He might secretly wander like a demon of darkness from one end of the continent to the other. He might enter into the confidence of the simple and unsuspecting. He might pour his poison into the minds of those who were before innocent. He might seduce them into love of his person, offer them advantages, pretend that his measures were honorable and beneficial, connect them in his plot, and attach them to his glory. Mr. Wirt's hypothetical case was beginning to show a striking resemblance to what Aaron Burr was charged with having done, and he was not yet through. This imaginary man might prepare the whole mechanism of the stupendous and destructive engine and put it in motion. Let the rest be done by his agents. He might then go 100 miles from the scene of action. Let him but keep himself from the scene of the assemblage and the immediate sight of battle, and he would be innocent in law, while those whom he had deluded would suffer the death of traitors. Who, he asked, is the most guilty of treason, the poor, weak, deluded instruments, or the artful and ambitious man who corrupted and misled them? There is no comparison between his guilt and theirs, and yet you secure impunity to him while they are to suffer death. Is this according to the rule of reason? Mr. Wirt launched forth on a lengthy dissertation on the subject of principles and accessories before and after the fact that did credit to his familiarity with legal precepts and the dicta of the authorities both in this country and in England. And now the speaker poised himself for the supreme effort, while a hush of anticipation fell over the assemblage. "Who is Blennerhassett?" he inquired in his melodious voice. "A native of Ireland, a man of letters, who fled from the storms of his own country to find quiet in ours? His history shows that war is not the natural element of his mind. If it had been, he never would have exchanged Ireland for America. So far is an army from furnishing the society natural and proper to Mr. Blennerhassett's character that, on his arrival in America, he retired even from the population of the Atlantic States and sought quiet and solitude in the bosom of our western forests. Let the Chief Justice be secretly amused. Mr. Wirt was not going to deny himself the superb opportunity of holding his audience spellbound with his oratorical gifts. But he carried with him taste and science and wealth, and to the desert smiled. Possessing himself of a beautiful island in the Ohio, he rears upon it a palace and decorates it with every romantic embellishment of fancy. A shrubbery that Shenstone might have envied blooms around him. An extensive library spreads its treasures before him. A philosophical apparatus offers to him all the secrets and mysteries of nature. Peace, tranquillity, and innocence shed their mingled delights around him. And to crown the enchantment of the scene, a wife, who is said to be lovely even beyond her sex, and graced with every accomplishment that can render it irresistible, had blessed him with her love and made him the father of several children. The evidence would convince you that this is but a faint picture of the real life." The speaker's countenance changed from joy to distress, and his voice assumed a solemn tone. "In the midst of all this grace, this innocent simplicity, and this tranquillity, this feast of the mind, this pure banquet of the heart, the destroyer comes. He comes to change this paradise into a hell. Yet the flowers do not wither at his approach. No monitory shuddering through the bosom of their unfortunate possessor warns him of the ruin that is coming upon him. A stranger presents himself, introduced to their civilities by the high rank which he had lately held in this country. He soon finds his way to their hearts by the dignity and elegance of his demeanor, the light and beauty of his conversation, and the seductive and fascinating power of his address. The conquest was not difficult. Innocence is ever simple and credulous. Conscious of no design itself, it suspects none in others. It wears no guard before its breast. Every door and portal and avenue of the heart is thrown open, and all who choose it enter. Such was the state of Eden when the serpent entered its bowers. The prisoner, in a more engaging form, winding himself into the open and unpractised heart of the unfortunate Blennerhassett, found but little difficulty in changing the native character of that heart and the objects of its affection. By degrees he infuses into it the poison of his own ambition. He breathes into it the fire of his own courage, a daring and desperate thirst for glory, an ardor panting for great enterprises, for all the storm and bustle and hurricane of life. In a short time the whole man is changed, and every object of his former delight is relinquished. No more he enjoys the tranquil scene. It has become flat and insipid to his taste. His books are abandoned. His retort and crucible are thrown aside. His shrubbery blooms and breathes its fragrance upon the air in vain. He likes it not. His ear no longer drinks in the rich melody of music. It longs for the trumpet's clangor and the cannon's roar. Even the prattle of babes, once so sweet, no longer affects him, and the angel smile of his wife, which hitherto touched his bosom with ecstasy so unspeakable, is now unseen and unfelt. Greater objects have taken possession of his soul. His imagination has been dazzled by visions of diadems, of stars and garters and titles of nobility. He has been taught to burn with restless emulation at the names of great heroes and conquerors. His enchanted island is destined soon to relapse into a wilderness, and in a few months we find the beautiful and tender partner of his bosom, whom he lately permitted not the winds of summer to visit too roughly, we find her shivering at midnight on the banks of the Ohio, and mingling her tears with the torrents that froze as they fell. Yet this unfortunate man, thus deluded from his interest and his happiness, thus seduced from the paths of innocence and peace, thus confounded in the toils that were deliberately spread for him, and overwhelmed by the mastering spirit and genius of another, this man, thus ruined and undone, and made to play a subordinate part in this grand drama of guilt and treason, this man is to be called the principal offender, while he, by whom he was plunged into misery, is comparatively innocent, a mere accessory. Is this reason? Is it law? Is it humanity? Sir, neither the human heart nor the human understanding will bear a perversion so monstrous and so absurd, so shocking to the soul, so revolting to the reason. Thus ended Wert's classic accusation of Burr. The time remaining to the speaker was devoted to a prosaic discussion of bellum levatum, as distinguished from bellum percussum. Gentlemen on the other side, said Mr. Wirt, asked for battles, bloody battles, hard knocks, the noise of cannon. But there was none. There did not have to be. The Constitution said levying war, not making war. He had recourse to his dictionary to show that the word levy means to raise, so there needed to be no force. The word force was used figuratively merely to signify the assembled body and not any deed of violence. Nevertheless, if the defense insisted upon force, did not the assemblage on Blennerhassett Island exert a species of potential force on the surrounding country? Did not Comfort Tyler and his party put that country into a state of consternation? What urged the state government of Ohio to send a body of men to take that party and seize its boats? What induced the state legislature to deliberate with closed doors? What caused the militia of Wood County, Virginia, to be put in motion and marched to the island? The speaker traced the wave of alarm as it moved from the island southward all the way to New Orleans. The day was almost spent when, with a sigh of weariness, Mr. Wirt announced that he had finished what he had to say. He begged pardon for consuming the time of the court so long. He thanked it for its patience with polite attention. He pleaded that he was much too exhausted to recapitulate his argument. But to such a court as that of the Chief Justices, he was sure that was unnecessary. After his masterly effort, Mr. Wirt would not have been human had he not felt a glow of satisfaction over his performance. Even those on the other side must have conceded that he had more than earned his fee. All that came after the portrayal of the relationship between Blennerhassett and Burr was anticlimax. That passage, duly recorded by Mr. Robertson, found its way into books of elocution and became one of the most popular pieces of literature to memorize and declaim. the Chief Justice was kind enough to remark that he had been greatly impressed by the speaker's eloquence. What effect it had on the members of the jury, for whose consumption it was chiefly intended, only they could say, and they left behind them no record of their reactions. There was also the effect on the prisoner, whose misdeeds had been so vividly described. The colonel sat through it all calmly, but with his alert mind he took in every word of it. It is said that in later years he entertained himself and his friends by reciting the more florid passages, and that his performance seldom failed to be rewarded with peals of derisive laughter. End of section 16. Read by Brian Fullen, Plano, Texas, September 2024. Section 17 of Shout Treason. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Shout Treason, The Trial of Aaron Burr by Francis F. Beirne. Chapter 17. Wirt's argument had consumed the better part of the day, but there was still a little time left before the regular hour for adjournment. Two of the lawyers for the prosecution having held the floor in succession, it was again the turn of the defense. Of Colonel Burr's lawyers, none was better equipped by temperament to counterbalance William Wirt than was Benjamin Botts. He, too, could boast the vigor and abandon of youth. In fact, he was the youngest of all the array of legal talent which had been attracted to the case. He was distinguished for his wit, and he was a master of ridicule, for which Mr. Wirt's florid oratory made an excellent target. As Wirt had set out after Wickham in his opening remarks, so young Botts turned his guns on Wirt. "I cannot promise you, sir, a speech manufactured out of tropes and figures," he began with mock apology. Then, alluding to Wirt's reference to an argument as naked as a sleeping Venus, he continued, "Instead of the introduction of a sleeping Venus, with all the luxury of voluptuous and wanton nakedness to charm the reason through the refined medium of sensuality, and to convince us that the law of treason is with the prosecution by leading our imaginations to the fascinating richness and symmetry of a heaving bosom and luscious waist, I am compelled to plod heavily and meekly on through the dull doctrines of Hale and Foster." Mr. Botts, too, was not without skill in playing up to the gross humor of an all-male audience. So far from reproving the gentleman's excitement of the boiling blood of such of us as are in the heyday of youth, without the previous caution of clearing the hall of those whose once panting desires have been chilled by age, and upon whom the forced ecstasy sat unnaturally and uneasy, I only lament my utter incapacity to elicit topics of legal science by an imitation of so novel and tempting an example. Nothing but the impossibility of success would prevent me also from grasping at the fame and glory on this grave occasion, and at this time of pleasure, of enriching the leering lasciviousness of a like bewildering thought to transport anew the old and the young. In such manner Mr. Botts soon put the assemblage in good humor. Even the Chief Justice, who enjoyed a joke as much as the next man, must have joined in the fun. Having thus ingratiated himself with his audience by this gay introduction, he proceeded to present his serious argument. His first proposition, he told them, would be to endeavor to establish the fact in support of the motion that the acts proved to have taken place on Blennerhassett Island were not in themselves acts of war, and that no intention could make them acts of war. What had actually happened? According to Mr. Botts, about 30 men had landed on the island and remained there for 2 or 3 days. It is true they had some arms and ammunition. They guarded their property at the boats. They prepared provisions to take with them down the river. At a place contiguous to the island, it was admitted that they had killed some squirrels. As notable a circumstance as any in this overt act was that they had what one of the witnesses called a watchword. All but Blennerhassett and Tyler were confessedly ignorant of the plan. They got alarmed on hearing the report of a mob and fled secretly in the night after Comfort Tyler had declared his purpose not to resist constituted authorities. Now, said Mr. Botts, the proposition of the opposing side was that there were acts of war, that they were intended first against the people of Wood County, Virginia, in which the island was situated, and then against New Orleans. He would suppose first that the acts were against Wood County. Very well, then. The boats, the oars, the provisions for a long journey, and after descent of the river were overt acts of levying war against Wood County. But, sir, the party was armed, he exclaimed, imitating the manner of the prosecution. Why? Mr. Botts contended that it showed they were expecting the people of Wood County would attack them. In other words, Mr. Botts apprehended that the people of Wood County meditated war on the people of the island, not that the islanders meditated war against the people of Wood County. Then, continued Mr. Botts, it was found that the people of the island had fled silently in the night from those of Wood County, and because they fled, it seems they were guilty of acts of war. On the other hand, said Mr. Botts, pursuing his argument, if the war was not against Wood County, it was against New Orleans, and New Orleans was 2,200 miles away. In the same playful mood, Mr. Botts suggested that the defendant might claim that these persons had no arms, or if they had guns, that they were not long enough to shoot all the way from the island to New Orleans. He presumed that the reply the prosecution would make to that was that no arms were necessary, that they might make war with their fingers. Or the defendant might urge that persons in this country have a right to carry arms, that it is also conformable to usage for people going down the river to kill ducks and other such game. The prosecution, Mr. Botts presumed, would answer that arms are not necessary, that they had 3 or 4 guns, a little powder and shot even to kill fowls, and 10 or 12 boats, that it was a most bloody war indeed, that without arms it would be war, but with these arms it was a most dangerous war against the United States. If this was making war against the United States, declared Mr. Botts, then, if I run away and hide to avoid a beating, I am guilty and may be convicted of assault and battery. Here Mr. Botts suggested the propriety of adjourning. When court met next morning and Mr. Botts resumed his argument, he was in the same facetious mood. Once more he went back to the charge of levying war, and recalled the failure of the grand juries in Mississippi and Kentucky to indict. The Mississippi Territory and Kentucky, as we are informed, were the seat of war, he observed. But the simpletons of that state and territory hunted but could not find the war. They were so stupid as not to perceive in a collection of men without arms, without any possible means of annoyance, without any hostile disposition, and without the possibility of getting away their women and families, anything criminal, much less any aptitude to overturn 2 mighty empires. It remained for us, the proud members of the Virginia bar, to come out and astonish the world with the profundity of our learning in matters of war. They have ascertained that there was a terrible war. I ask you, what manner of war was it? We have had a much more serious war here than on the island. We have had here a carnage of breaths, sour looks, and hard words, and the roaring of vocal cannon. We have had a battle with the laws and the Constitution fought courageously and furiously by our enemy. Is it not a mockery to speak of the war on Blennerhassett Island? Shall we not be the sport of Europe and the world by such a discussion? In spite of the nation's independence, which it now had enjoyed for a matter of more than 30 years, the Virginia bar still did obeisance to that of England. Though Burke had died in 1797, and Charles James Fox and the younger Pitt had gone to join their fathers within the year, counsel in the Burr case transferred their veneration to their successors in Westminster. They seemed to have imagined fatuously that this spirit of camaraderie was reciprocated, and that the great men of England had temporarily put aside the affairs of empire to follow every move being made by opposing counsel in the hall of the Virginia House of Delegates in Richmond. Now, continued Mr. Botts, Mr. Hay had said that constructive treason in this country would not be dangerous. Mr. Botts would suppose an imaginary case. He would suppose that there had been well-grounded apprehension of an approaching war with a neighboring and powerful nation. He would suppose that the United States had a feeble army in the neighborhood of the boundary line between the two countries, and that the American general had orders to fall back. Mr. Botts, be it noted, was as good at making hypothetical cases for the defense as was Mr. Wirt for the prosecution. He would suppose that the populous, rich city of New Orleans was in danger of invasion. He would suppose that a hero distinguished for military science and valor, and as patriotic as he was ambitious of honorable fame, but whose good nature was blighted and blasted by the malice of his countrymen, should have seen the dangers hanging over his country. New Orleans threatened with invasion and conquest by a Spanish force, the citizens there in danger of murder and captivity, their wives and daughters ready to be prey to Spanish lust, and all else in that favored country exposed to desolation. He would suppose that the hero knew that a band of faithful patriots could be collected immediately around his standard. He would suppose that with this band of patriots, the hero should at this fortunate and critical moment have rescued the country, the army, the people, by a reasonable relief to the decrepit and half-baffled forces of the United States. He would suppose that in the same magnanimous spirit the hero should after this have gone on his own enterprise to establish the independence of the Mexicans and give liberty to millions now groaning under bondage. Suppose he had done all this, he would have acquired immortal glory and be renowned in future ages as the deliverer of his country, worshipped as its idol, and called its savior, as Washington was. Thus Mr. Botts artfully contrived to present the character of Aaron Burr as his defenders chose to imagine it. The defense scored the prosecution for trying to introduce constructive treason into the United States. It did not object to introducing constructive heroism, provided the figure was Colonel Burr. The colonel laughed at William Wort's extravagant language. Is it not possible that he stifled a cynical smile as he heard himself thus being glorified by young Botts? Mr. Botts' supposing ended, he next described in heart-rending language the manner in which the well-meaning and patriotic colonel had been basely betrayed and thwarted. In what some might have considered not too good taste, he recalled that Christ himself had been abused, mocked, and spit upon. Why, then, should not a mere mortal man be in like manner abused? The young champion next raised his lance against the President of the United States. He charged that Mr. Jefferson's interference with the prosecution of the case was improper, illegal, and unconstitutional. He had no doubt, he said, that the President had acted from good intentions without sufficiently reflecting on the subject, and that he was inadvertently following one of the very worst English examples in the most arbitrary reigns. He wished Mr. Jefferson could be at his side now to hear what could be said on the subject. Young Mr. Botts was sufficiently sure of his powers of persuasion to believe that under those circumstances Mr. Jefferson would be convinced that he had done wrong. Then Mr. Botts came to his concluding peroration. "We are told," he said, "that the virtue of the people will do everything, that the voice of the people must be heard and must decide where they are sovereign, that the voice of the people is the voice of God, and that a majority of the people must always do right. I hope the gentleman will not refer the fate of individuals accused in the sudden and violent impulse of their feelings and passions. There are cases where individuals have been sacrificed by the voice of the people. Socrates was made to drink the hemlock, and Aristides was banished by the people. Admiral Byng was made to die for the same cause. Jefferson was run down in the year 1780 by the voice of the people. Mr. Bott's reference here was to the unpopularity of Mr. Jefferson during the Revolution when he was governor of Virginia and the state was invaded by the British, and complaints of Mr. Jefferson's ineffectiveness in meeting the crisis raised murmurs for his impeachment. After that, Mr. Botts was back again appealing to Holy Writ to drive home his point. Reformation and Christianity itself proved the general errors subject to pervade the people. Jesus Christ himself was crucified by the people. On this sacred note, Mr. Botts closed his discourse. He had proved himself to be as entertaining as any of the elder brethren of the bar. The industrious Mr. Robertson rendered yeoman service in recording the lengthy and often tedious proceedings. Even he was beginning to tire. He concluded it was not necessary to set down all that was said. Instead, he contented himself with making the entry, "Here some facetious and pleasant remarks passed between Mr. Botts and Mr. MacRae, which afforded amusement for the moment, but are omitted as irrelevant to the report." Irrelevant? Who knows but that if Mr. Robertson had recorded the facetious and pleasant remarks that Mr. MacRae made in his exchange with Mr. Botts, Mr. MacRae might have been spared the ignominy of going down to posterity as a sour Scotsman. Soon after there appeared the entry. Here a desultory conversation ensued between Mr. Botts and Mr. Wirt, in which some warm and animated observations were made respecting the evidence and Mr. Wirt's comments thereon. Had Mr. Bott's ridicule got under Mr. Wirt's skin? At this point the Chief Justice poured oil on the troubled waters by remarking that the evidence was such that different gentlemen might draw different inferences from it. After Botts came the district attorney's turn again. "I cannot," he confessed with his customary modesty, "instruct you by my learning, amuse you by my wit, make you laugh by my drollery, nor delight you with my eloquence. All I can do is to express to you in plain language the convictions, perhaps, of a mistaken judgment." Here was no mock humility, but the sincere outpouring of a spirit oppressed by the knowledge that among his colleagues of the Richmond bar he was labeled as a mediocrity. Hay would have been even duller of wit than public opinion made him out to be if he had not noted the special consideration assigned to such of his contemporaries as Wickham, Botts, and Wirt. He could have consoled himself with the reflection that in such an assemblage humility was a rare and welcome virtue. Mr. Hay had no sooner fairly begun on his discourse than he made an allusion to Justice Samuel Chase and his conduct in the Fry's case, in which he had strained the law to convict for the government. The censure the judge brought on himself, observed Mr. Hay, was not on account of his opinions, but for his arbitrary and irregular conduct at the trial. Chase, he reminded, attempted to wrest the decision from the jury and prejudged the case before hearing all the evidence in it. It was, said Mr. Hay, the identical thing this court was being called on to do by the gentlemen of the defense. At this, the gentlemen of the defense pricked up their ears. Mr. Hay was to hear from them later. The remark about Justice Chase was preliminary to a dissertation on the institution of trial by jury. If, Hay averred, it shall ever be determined by this court that it has it in its power to take the decision of facts from the jury, the trial by jury, one of the greatest bulwarks of civil liberty, may be struck down and destroyed. The great question at issue in this case, he said, was compounded of law and of fact, of which latter the jury were the judges. Therefore, every allegation which related to the indictment, all the evidence relating to and bearing on the issue, ought to be brought forward and heard by the jury. The prosecution held that Colonel Burr was guilty of levying war against the United States. Colonel Burr said he was not. The evidence the defense sought to exclude bore directly on the point at issue. Mr. Hay expressed himself as positive the framers of the Constitution never intended to take the decision of the general issue in a criminal case away from the consideration of the jury and give it to the judge. The speaker paused for an impressive moment and then, selecting his words with care, addressed the bench. I consider this principle of the trial by jury, preserved in its uttermost purity and independence, as connected with the best principles of the human heart. It ought to be viewed and approached with the utmost reverence and caution, and when a judge is called to do what may lead him to encroach on this principle, he will advance with the utmost circumspection and awe. I will take the liberty to say that it will be far more safe and correct to remain 1,000 miles on this side of the line which separates the rights of the jury from those of the court, than to go a hair's breadth beyond it. And if he should encroach, he ought for no human consideration to touch it. If ever he do, he undermines civil liberty. That short dissertation on trial by jury must have made some of those present wonder if they had misjudged when they wrote George Hay off as a mediocrity. The district attorney returned to the old question of whether actual presence of the accused at the scene of the overt act was necessary to sustain a charge of treason. Suppose, he said, Colonel Burr had never been on the spot where the overt act was committed. Suppose he knew his men were there and about to be attacked. Suppose he sent more men there to help them, along with arms, ammunition, and provision, and all other things necessary for their defense. Suppose an attack was made and repelled, and thousands fell in the battle. Would it be contended by the gentlemen of the defense that Aaron Burr, not having been personally present when this overt act of his procurement was committed, was not a principal but an accessory? That his soldiers were principals in treason, but he was not? To prove the fallacy, Mr. Hay proposed that they look at the result. He is innocent and safe. They are guilty and punished. Is it possible, he asked, that the human mind can be so perplexed by learning and so misled by ingenuity, so totally bereaved of all its powers, as to adopt a conclusion like this? Mr. Hay closed his argument by reverting to Mr. Wickham's expressed fear that the doctrine the prosecution asked the court to sanction would be fatal to the liberty and happiness of the people of the United States. He pictured Mr. Wickham trembling for his country, himself, and his posterity, lest the prosecution succeed. I, too, am a citizen of this country, he declared, and the father of children for whose happiness and welfare I feel a solicitude as lively and affectionate as any parent can feel. To the true happiness of my country, I hope I know that I am sincerely and ardently attached. But I see no danger. I apprehend none for myself or my posterity. I am perfectly willing to risk my own life, liberty and happiness, and those of my posterity on the propriety of the principles which we recommend. Let them avoid traitorous conspiracies and designs fatal to the liberty and happiness of their fellow citizens. Let them avoid traitorous assemblies, overt acts of war, and they will be safe. Thus concluded Mr. Hay. Next on the list of pleaders was Luther Martin, but he sent word to the court that he was not ready, so Mr. Charles Lee of the defense arose to fill the breach. It was one of the rare occasions when he was recorded as having spoken. Counsel for the defense had been waiting impatiently for a chance to pounce on the district attorney from the moment he brought up Justice Chase and the Fry's case. Now Mr. Lee had that agreeable opportunity. The gentleman said in substance there was no difference between the opinion which we desire you to give and that for which Judge Chase was impeached, charged Mr. Lee, addressing the Chief Justice. It was very kind of the gentleman to remind the court of the danger of a decision of the motion in favor of the prisoner, a decision like that which has already produced the impeachment of another judge. Mr. Lee knew full well he was touching a tender spot. By thus accusing the district attorney, he was acting on the popular belief among Judge Marshall's friends that the Chief Justice was himself as much on trial as was the prisoner at the bar. Mr. Hay was prompt to do what he could to counteract that impression. "The cases are different," he replied. "What I said was only said to put Mr. Botts right in his misrepresentation. It was innocently said and compatible with the highest respect for the court, not with the design which the gentleman, I will not say candidly, insinuates." Here the Chief Justice intervened. "I did not consider you as making any personal allusion, but as merely referring to the law," he assured Mr. Hay. Thus, with an exhibition of his customary common sense, Judge Marshall graciously accepted Mr. Hay's explanation, whatever his innermost thoughts might have been. Mr. Lee, however, persisted. The gentleman plainly insinuated the possibility of danger to the court from a favorable opinion to the prisoner, he protested, because he said that the opinion which we claimed for him was the same in substance as had occasioned the impeachment of one judge already. It certainly would not be unfair to infer that it was intended to show that the same cause might again produce the same effect. Colonel Burr's urgent request that the trial be expedited seemed doomed to failure. Mr. Lee, having been less long-winded than his colleagues, completed his argument some time before the hour of adjournment. The proposal was made to send a messenger to summon Mr. Martin, whose appearance was next on the agenda, but the lawyers of the defense who were present declined to do so, stating again that Mr. Martin was not yet ready. The court therefore adjourned for the day. It was not until Friday morning, August 28, that Mr. Martin at last made his entry and rose to address the court. In speech and appearance he was coarse and crude. Toward his enemies he could be vindictive, as he already had shown in the previous proceedings of the trial. His emotions were as violently stirred in behalf of those he called his friends. On the other hand, no one surpassed him in his knowledge of the law and in the application of that knowledge to whatever case he might be pleading. At the moment, Colonel Burr enjoyed his complete loyalty, and since his introduction to her a few weeks before, he had developed a consuming admiration for Theodosia Alston. Now came the supreme opportunity to serve them both. Mr. Martin opened his address with an expression of regret that the artifices and persecutions of his enemies had placed Colonel Burr in his present predicament. But, he continued, "I shall ever feel the sincerest gratitude to heaven that my life has been preserved to this time, that I am enabled to appear before this court in his defense." And if the efforts of these highly respectable and eminent gentlemen with whom I have the honor to be associated, united with my feeble aid, be successful in rescuing a gentleman for whom I with pleasure avow my friendship and esteem from the fangs of his persecutors, if our joint efforts shall be successful in wiping away the tears of filial piety, in healing the deep wounds inflicted on the breast of the child by the envenomed shafts of hatred and malice hurled at the heart of the father, if our efforts shall succeed in preserving youth, innocence, elegance, and merit from despair, from distraction, it will be to me the greatest pleasure. What dear delight will my heart enjoy! How ineffable, how supreme will be my blessing! The solicitude of the elderly gentleman for the prisoner's daughter was not lost on his audience. The old and kindly disposed no doubt heard them and were touched. The young and cynical were amused that the old man's infatuation for the beautiful young matron was capable of producing such eloquence. It was one of the current jokes of the town. However, pursued the speaker, private friendship for the accused and his connections was not his only inducement. He was as well thankful to heaven that when a question as to the right construction of the principles of treason was to be decided, on which the happiness or misery of the present and future ages depended, he was to have an opportunity to exert to the utmost his feeble talents in opposing principles which he considered so destructive as those advanced on the present occasion. If he and his colleagues, said Mr. Martin, were able to satisfy the court that the principles, the reverse of those contended for on the part of the prosecution, ought to be established, he would think he had not lived in vain. Mr. Martin took pains to make it clear that neither Colonel Burr nor his counsel had ever admitted or suggested that Harmon Blennerhassett was guilty of treason. What, then, was the propriety of Mr. Wirt saying that they were willing to sacrifice him, and that he might be hanged without pity or remorse on their part? Mr. Martin then brought to bear all the wisdom acquired during his 36 years at the bar. He referred to Hale and Hawkins. He recalled the statute of 39 Elizabeth Cap 15, wherein A and B both consented to enter a house to rob, and only A entered and B stood by, wherefore A was ousted of his clergy, while B still had it. He cited the case of Pudsey in 1 Hale 534 to show how it came within the general principles of the cases of constructive presence as stated in Foster 349. He too mentioned the case of my Lord Decra, who came with a band of men to steal deer in the park of one Pelham, and he noted that Hawkins, in his second volume, chapter 9, section 8, page 442, also explained very clearly the principle of constructive presence. He admitted that in Great Britain there was a species of treason which consisted in the intention without any act consummating the guilt of treason. He meant, of course, compassing the death of the king when the crime was only imagined. But in America, since there was no king, there were only two species of treason, which were levying war against the United States or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Sir, he exclaimed, I execrate a contrary doctrine as highly tyrannical and oppressive, and here I beg leave to enter my censure against the decisions of the court in Pennsylvania on this subject in the cases of what are called the whiskey and the hot water insurrections. Having thus abruptly paid his compliments to the American judges with whose decisions he differed, he went back across the sea to England, and John Wedderbourne's case and Deacon's case, and that of the king against Captain Vaughan, who went aboard a vessel called the Loyal Clancarty in the service of the French king to cruise against the subjects of the English king. As he expounded the law in this masterly fashion, how could he have failed to bring a blush to the cheek of Mr. Ritchie of the Enquirer, who had used his columns to belittle Luther Martin and scoff at the absurdity of importing a Maryland lawyer to try a case in a Virginia court? It was gossiped that during the preparation for his appearance, Mr. Martin had drunk even more freely than was his usual custom. If so, the indulgence had done nothing to befuddle his brain or dim his memory of precedents. Next he turned to the incident of Lord Balmerino entering the gates of Carlisle and holding the city for the Pretender. He cited other allegedly treasonable acts having to do with the efforts of the Stuarts to regain their throne. This was a fruitful field for English precedents for acts of treason. But, he contended, those who had levied war in Perth were charged with levying it in Perth. So, too, were those who levied war in Aberdeen charged with levying it in Aberdeen. He could find no case in which a person was charged with levying war in a place where he was not present. But, he observed, if the counsel for the Crown in Great Britain had found out this new doctrine discovered by the ingenuity of the counsel for this prosecution, prosecutions would have been easily conducted and much trouble saved. If this new doctrine be, as the gentlemen affect to believe, unanswerably correct, then it shows incontrovertibly great ignorance on the part of the lawyers who prosecuted in Great Britain in encountering so much unnecessary trouble and adopting a mode of prosecution so difficult as they did, and the superior ingenuity of the gentlemen in discovering this very easy and plain mode. Then Mr. Martin was off after Nicholas Throgmorton, following his case with allusions to the cases of Alice Lisle and Mary Speake, who were so despitefully treated by Judge Jeffreys of the bloody assizes. He delved into the 18th year of the reign of King Edward I to bring forth the case of Bagot de Clare, to whose house one John Wallis, a clerk, brought a letter of citation from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and some of de Clare's family forced Wallis to eat the process and wax seal affixed thereto, and de Clare pleaded that he was not required to answer the suit brought against him until the principal actors had been convicted. So he was released on bail to answer after the principals had been convicted, from which incident, which had happened more than 5 centuries before, Mr. Martin sought to prove that in the state of Virginia in the year of our Lord 1807, Colonel Burr could not legally be brought to trial until Harmon Blennerhassett had been tried and convicted. If Mr. Bott's allusion to the crucifixion and Mr. McRae's use of Uriah's death through the connivance of David are accepted, Mr. Martin deserved the prize for going farthest back into history for a precedent. The speaker had occupied the time of the court for the entire day, and the hour was growing late. When asked if he could finish his argument that evening, he replied that he could not. So the court was adjourned until the usual hour on the morrow, and judge, jury, learned counsel, prisoner, witnesses, and spectators drew a sigh of relief and went off to refresh themselves and enjoy as much of a night's rest as the hot, humid atmosphere permitted. When court reconvened on Saturday morning, August 29, Mr. Martin resumed his argument. Here he gave his attention to the opinion in the case of Bowman and Swartwout. He brought out that when the opinion was given, only 4 of the 7 judges of the Supreme Court were sitting. Would 4 judges in an extrajudicial manner have undertaken to settle the construction of the law so infinitely important to the United States? Would they have decided so important a question in a collateral, irregular manner on a point not immediately before them, and that also without the aid of the other 3 judges? Even if they had done so, contended Mr. Martin. Their decision certainly deserves no credit as binding on this court. As a binding judicial opinion, it ought to have no more weight than the ballad or song of Chevy Chase. Mr. Martin alluded to Mr. Hayes' statement with great zeal and pathos that he pledged his own life and the life of his children and posterity on the propriety of the doctrine which he has advocated, that if they avoid conspiracies, that if they be innocent, they will be safe. A most elusive doctrine, he exclaimed, and he warned Mr. Hay, if he be now in the full tide of successful experiment, in the enjoyment of the approbation of his country and his government, so was, not long ago, the gentleman whom I advocate. He was as highly distinguished by the kind favor of the people as could be by their suffrages. It was incredible that their favor should so soon be changed to calumny and rancor of party into the most malignant hatred. The gentleman may now think himself perfectly safe by the prevalence of his party and his principles, but the day very possibly may come when he may find himself as obnoxious as the gentleman whom I defend. He may possibly by the same means, the malice, the injustice and violence of party spirit, like my client, not only find himself reviled and calumniated, but his dearest friends abused and persecuted. I should be sorry that such a prediction should be realized with respect to any gentleman, but such are the natural consequences of his own pernicious doctrine and those we oppose. And now the speaker arrived at the end of his argument. Those of the assemblage whose minds may have wandered, now and then, in the course of Mr. Martin's exposition of the technicalities of the law, were brought to attention by the solemnity of his countenance and the careful weighing of his words. When the sun mildly shines upon us, when the gentle zephyrs play around us, we can easily proceed forward in the straight path of our duty. But when the bleak clouds enshroud the sky with darkness, when the tempest rages, the winds howl and the waves break over us, when the thunders awfully roar over our heads and the lightnings of heaven blaze around us, it is then that all the energies of the human soul are called into action. It is then that the truly brave man stands firm at his post. It is then that by an unshaken performance of duty, man approaches the nearest possible to the divinity. Nor is there any object in the creation on which the Supreme Being can look down with more delight and approbation than on a human being in such a situation and thus acting. The speaker turned to look straight into the eyes of the Chief Justice as he continued, May that God who now looks down upon us, who has in his infinite wisdom called you into existence and placed you in that seat to dispose justice to your fellow citizens, to preserve and protect innocence against persecution, may that God so illuminate your understanding that you may know what is right, and may he nerve your soul with firmness and fortitude to act according to that knowledge. So saying, Mr. Martin shuffled over to his seat. It is a safe assumption that the Chief Justice was not a little moved. There were souvenir hunters even in those early days. In the Gazette and General Advertiser, organ of Richmond's Federalists, on the morning of August 31 appeared this advertisement. The gentleman who, while I was on Saturday last addressing the court, took my cane from the seat behind me and carried it away, is respectfully requested to send it when he has done with it to the bar of the Swan Tavern. Luther Martin. It hardly required a public notice to let people know where Mr. Martin, in his moments of relaxation, was most likely to be found. End of section 17. Read by Brian Fullen, Plano, Texas, September 2024. Section 18 of Shout Treason. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Shout Treason. The Trial of Aaron Burr by Francis F. Beirne. Chapter 18. One of the principals who failed to hear Luther Martin's masterly argument was Harman Blennerhassett. He felt unwell on Thursday. On Friday he awoke with a continuation of his indisposition, attended by a fever which made him so miserable he returned to bed without waiting for breakfast. In keeping with the prevailing custom, he dosed himself with 3 or 4 grains of calomel. Blennerhassett was a hypochondriac, but on this occasion his ailment was not imaginary. He was a victim of influenza, which suddenly struck Richmond in epidemic form. Next day the news reached him in the penitentiary that half the families in the town were afflicted. The disease hit the staff of the Enquirer so hard that it was with the greatest difficulty that popular organ of public opinion continued publication. Kind Mrs. Gamble heard of Blennerhassett's illness and did what she could to contribute to his comfort. On Sunday she sent him fruit and fresh butter and fine calf's foot jelly nicely chilled in ice. The same day he was honored by a call from Mr. Martin, and was by that time sufficiently recovered to receive the visitor. Mr. Martin appeared none the worse for wear as a result of his very strenuous labor in court. Blennerhassett recommended his brandy as being considered superior, and put a pint tumbler before the Marylander. No ceremonies retarded the libation. Blennerhassett's absence from the court during the time Mr. Martin held the floor was not to deprive him of the privilege of getting a generous sample of the gentleman's eloquence and wisdom. The visit did not exceed 35 minutes, yet so fluent was the speaker that he delivered an account of an entire week's proceedings in the trial. He not only quoted verbatim long extracts from his own speech, but also extracts from the speeches of other lawyers on both sides of the case. Mr. Martin also regaled his host with whole columns from a series of papers which he had written under the pen name of Investigator. He also caricatured Jefferson and gave a history of his acquaintance with Burr, expatiating on the latter's virtues and suffering. These last were not received enthusiastically by Mr. Blennerhassett. At the moment he happened to be feeling particularly aggrieved over the manner in which he had been duped by the adventurer. In fact, the laudatory comments on Burr made by Martin raised the suspicion that he had been deliberately sent by Burr to restore Blennerhassett's good humor as a precaution against the ever-present danger of his turning state's evidence. Among other things, Martin expressed the opinion that because Burr had alleged he expected a war between Spain and the United States, his expedition was lawful. But, countered Blennerhassett, may not a jury think Burr did not expect war and find their verdict then on the confession? If Burr supposed that Blennerhassett would be favorably impressed by Martin, he was greatly mistaken. The latter had hardly left his presence before Blennerhassett sat down and went to work drawing one of those pen portraits which were so much the vogue at the time among those who laid any claim to literary talent. His manner, wrote Blennerhassett, is rude, and his language ungrammatical, which is cruelly aggravated upon his hearers by the verbosity and repetitions of his style. Fancy has been as much denied to his mind as grace to his person or habits. These are gross and incapable of restraint, even on the most solemn public occasions. The influenza skipped the Chief Justice. Perhaps it considered it futile to attempt an assault on his hardy constitution. It was just as well, for over the week-end he had strenuous work to do. Court had adjourned late Saturday afternoon. It was scheduled to reconvene early Monday morning. In the approximately 36 hours between adjournment and reconvening, it was Judge Marshall's task to review the arguments presented, weigh them against each other, and arrive at a conclusion to be contained in a written opinion. The judge was taking no chances. He knew that whatever opinion he might render would be immediately scanned in Washington and perhaps misconstrued, that any slip he might make would be used against him. Sunday was an important day in Richmond when almost everybody went to church. The Roman Catholics were ministered to by the Abbé Dubois, a refugee from the French Revolution, who said Mass in the courtroom of the Capitol. Methodists and Baptists were numerous and had their own churches. The House of Delegates was the scene of an unusual example of denominational cooperation between the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians. The two sects were led respectively by Parson John Buchanan and Parson John Blair, devoted friends who, in their lighter moments, discussed philosophy and punned in Latin. Buchanan was a bachelor and well-heeled. Blair had numerous progeny and was hard-pressed to make ends meet. So Parson Buchanan applied his logic to the practical end of convincing Parson Blair that all of Parson Buchanan's fees for marriages, funerals, and the like should go by right to Parson Blair. The Presbyterians did not yet have a church, and the only Episcopal church was St. John's, on a high hill to the east and hard to reach. The upshot of it was that Episcopalians and Presbyterians worshipped together in the House of Delegates, with Parson Buchanan and Parson Blair occupying the pulpit on alternate Sundays. Whether Sunday, August 30, 1807, was Parson Buchanan's turn in the pulpit or Parson Blair's, history does not record. Judge Marshall was an intimate of both parsons and a devout churchman as well, but it is unlikely that, with the exacting business in hand, he found time to attend church that day. Even with that allowance, there was not much time for reflection. A plausible explanation is that while the lawyers were debating, the Chief Justice was formulating his opinion. This was to be the longest in the whole trial, and the one containing the most references to the authorities. It may well be that he made notes of these authorities cited by the speakers as the argument proceeded. Did he work by candlelight long into the night? Did he wake up with the birds and labor during the cool hours of the early morning? Or did he sit under the trees in his spacious yard during the day, braving the critical looks of his neighbors as they returned from church? Whatever the Chief Justice's method, when court met on Monday morning, August 31, he was ready to deliver his opinion. Counsel, jury, and the public in attendance knew that the crisis in the trial had been reached. The ever-courteous Marshal made use of his introduction to compliment counsel on both sides. The motion, he said, had been argued in a manner worthy of its importance, and with an earnestness evincing the strong conviction felt by opposing counsel that the law was with them. A degree of eloquence, he declared, seldom displayed on any occasion has embellished a solidity of argument and a depth of research by which the court has been greatly aided in forming the opinion it is about to deliver. The Chief Justice restated the issue, which was that, the testimony having shown that the prisoner was not present when the overt act mentioned in the indictment took place, objection had been raised that testimony offered to connect him with those who committed the overt act was totally irrelevant and therefore must be rejected. His first task was to clarify the confusion arising out of the opinion in the Bowman and Swartwout case, which already had been brought up by counsel on both sides. It was said that it was on the basis of that opinion that the grand jury had seen fit to bring in the indictments for treason. The offending phrase was the one which said, If a body of men be actually assembled for the purpose of effecting by force a treasonable object, all those who perform any part, however minute or however remote from the scene of action, and who are actually leaguered in the general conspiracy, are to be considered as traitors. If the phrase meant what it seemed to mean, then surely the absence of Colonel Burr from Blennerhassett Island at the time of the alleged overt act in no way relieved him of his guilt. Was the phrase a mere obiter dictum, or chance remark, as the defense maintained, or was it a formal declaration of the court changing the previous conception of treason as laid down in the Constitution as the prosecution assumed it to be? The time had come for the Chief Justice to make known which interpretation was correct. He had heard, said Judge Marshall, that his opinion had been construed to mean that any assemblage whatever for a treasonable purpose, whether in force or not in force, whether in condition to use violence or not in that condition, was levying war. It had not been expressly advanced by the bar, but he understood it had been adopted elsewhere. Anyone who was at all conversant with the existing political situation knew that the interpretation referred to was that of President Jefferson. It had been adopted by his partisans, and it was because it had gained such a firm hold that the incidents of Blennerhassett Island, mild as they were assumed by the prosecution to fulfill the Chief Justice's definition of an overt act of levying war. Judge Marshall pointed out that the court which gave the opinion was composed of 4 judges. Of these, he said, one was sick. He seemed uncertain as to this judge's opinion. 3 judges were absent. Therefore, said the Chief Justice, if the 3 judges who were absent concurred with the sick judge who was present, and perhaps dissents, a majority of the judges might overrule the decision. A critical observer might have charged that the Chief Justice was falling back upon a good many suppositions. What, he asked, was levying war? He had, he said, looked at all the English authorities and, so far as he could see, levying war meant just that. The words had received no technical meaning different from their natural meaning. The assemblage must be a warlike assemblage, carrying the appearance of force, and in a situation to practice hostility. The Chief Justice added for good measure that the American judges, so far as their opinions had been quoted, seemed to go even farther than the English authorities and require the actual exercise of force. But, he reminded, it had been said that all these authorities had been overruled by the decision of the Supreme Court in the case of the United States versus Bowman and Swartwout. Now it would be expected that an opinion which was to overrule all former precedents and to establish a principle never before recognized would be expressed in plain and explicit terms. Had the intention been to make so material a change, then the court ought to have expressly declared that any assemblage of men whatever who had formed a treasonable design constituted the fact of levying war. Yet no such declaration was made. What was more, said the Chief Justice, in the case of Bowman and Swartwout, there was no evidence that even these 2 men had met for the purpose of executing a plan. In their case, the issue of an assemblage did not appear. In short, the Chief Justice asserted that general expressions ought not to be considered as overruling settled principles without a direct declaration to that effect. Thus, at last, the ghost of the opinion in the case of Bowman and Swartwout was laid by the same hand that had raised him. At least the Chief Justice must have hoped so. It was not often that his rare gift of logical reasoning was put to so severe a test. By this time, counsel for the prosecution must have seen how the wind was blowing, if they had ever harbored any doubts about it. The Chief Justice now got to the nub of his opinion. It was essential, he said, that an indictment be explicit as to the nature of the crime and the place where it was committed. Otherwise, the accused would not know how to defend himself. The whole treason laid in the indictment was the levying of war on Blennerhassett Island, and the whole question was whether the prisoner was legally present. It was as if no other overt act ever had existed. Therefore, said Judge Marshall, the only point the court was examining was the constructive presence of the prisoner at the fact charged. Now, said he, had Burr arrived on the island, he would have been present in fact, or had he taken a position near enough to cooperate with those on the island, the question of whether he was constructively present would be a compound of law and fact, which the jury would decide with the assistance of the court as respected the law. On the other hand, if the prisoner was not with the party at the time, did not intend to join it, and if his cooperation was at a great distance, in fact in a different state, then he was not constructively present. Therefore, the judge confessed that he was strongly of the opinion that proof of the actual or legal presence of the prisoner on the island by the evidence of two witnesses could not be made. But, continued the judge, the prosecution might contend that the indictment did not charge the prisoner with actually being present at the assemblage on the island, but that, though he was not at it, he caused it. If the law was as the prosecution maintained, then the procurement of the assemblage took the place of presence at the assemblage. In that case, he insisted, under the Constitution, procurement of an assemblage should be testified to by two witnesses, just like presence at an overt act. Judge Marshall pointed out that, because the advising of treason or the procuring of treason was a secret matter of the mind rather than an actual deed, it might be objected that it would be hard to prove. But, he retorted, the mere difficulty of proving a fact surely did not justify a conviction without proof. Was the testimony the government proposed to offer to prove the overt act laid in the indictment? No, it was evidence of subsequent transactions at a different place and in a different state. Such testimony, he declared, was not relevant. It could be produced only as corroborative or confirmatory testimony, if it could be produced at all. The Chief Justice had now dealt with the decision in the Bowman and Swartwout case and made it clear that it had not been intended to serve as a new rule of law introducing constructive treason into the United States. He had followed that up by showing that neither Colonel Burr's actual presence nor legal presence on the island at the time of the overt act had been proved. This done, he was coming to the end of his opinion. The words he was about to speak had evidently been carefully chosen. He must have been aware of the solemnity of the moment, even though he may not have foreseen that he was speaking for posterity as he began. Much has been said in the course of the argument on points on which the court feels no inclination to comment particularly, but which may, perhaps not improperly, receive some notice. That this court dares not usurp power is most true. That this court dares not shrink from its duty is not less true. No man is desirous of becoming the peculiar subject of calumny. No man, might he let the cup pass from him without self-reproach, would drain it to the bottom. But he has no choice in the case, if there be no alternative presented to him but a dereliction of duty or the opprobrium of those who are denominated the world. He merits contempt as well as the indignation of his country. Who can hesitate which to embrace? There spoke the soldier of the American Revolution. Not all the power that could be exerted by the presidential office, Not all the threats of public violence nor the prospect of public scorn could frighten John Marshall from doing his duty as he saw it. If Aaron Burr was to be found guilty of treason, it would be only after he had been granted all the protection that was due him under the Constitution and the laws of the land. If that be an undue encroachment of the judiciary on the powers of the executive and the legislature, let Mr. Jefferson make the most of it. The result of the whole, concluded Judge Marshall, returning to his customary calm judicial language, is a conviction as complete as the mind of the court is capable of receiving on a complex subject, that the motion must prevail. He observed that the jury had heard the opinion of the court on the law of the case. They would now apply that law to the fact, and would find a verdict of guilty or not guilty as their conscience might dictate. Although the great probability of an opinion ruling out the rest of the evidence must have been foreseen by the prosecution, Mr. Hay was momentarily confused as to how next to proceed. So, as soon as the Chief Justice had concluded his remarks to the jury, the district attorney requested that the court grant him time to consider it. Judge Marshall readily agreed, and an adjournment was taken until the morrow. Whatever courses the counsel for the prosecution may have discussed among themselves during the evening, they came upon no plan to counter the opinion of the Chief Justice. So, when the court met next day, Mr. Hay announced that he had nothing to offer the jury either of evidence or argument, and must, therefore, leave the case to it. At the order of the Chief Justice, the jury then retired. The assemblage was not kept long in suspense. Soon the jury was on its way back to the courtroom, led by its foreman, Colonel Carrington. Asked by Judge Marshall if a verdict had been reached, the colonel arose and replied, "We of the jury say that Aaron Burr is not proved to be guilty under this indictment by any evidence submitted to us. We therefore find him not guilty." Not guilty by any evidence submitted to us. Did the jury then mean to imply that had some of the evidence not been withheld under the motion made by the defense and sustained by the Chief Justice, it would have found Aaron Burr guilty? Would that not be the impression made on the public? If such an impression were made on the public, could the verdict then be regarded as an exoneration? Colonel Burr did not think so. He was on his feet at once protesting, and he was supported in his protest by other counsel for the defense. The colonel called the verdict unusual, informal, and irregular. He demanded that the objectionable qualification be stricken out. Luther Martin called it a tempest in a teapot. Colonel Carrington interposed to say that if the objections to the offending passage were continued, the jury would strike it out. He was immediately contradicted by his fellow juryman, Richard E. Parker, an ardent Jeffersonian, who shouted that it had been inserted deliberately and that it would stay there. Judge Marshall listened patiently throughout the controversy and compromised the issue by stating that, in the opinion of the court, the verdict was in effect the same as a verdict for acquittal. He would therefore let it stand in the bill as the jury had pronounced it. The entry made on the record would be simply "not guilty." With his customary courtesy, the Chief Justice thanked the jury for its patient attention during the whole course of the long and tedious trial and dismissed it. Attorney Hay, recognizing the hopelessness of getting a verdict of treason on the basis of the assemblage on Blennerhassett Island, therefore entered a nolle prosequi to the indictments of Blennerhassett and the other alleged conspirators. That is to say, having failed to convict Burr, the government would drop the charges against his subordinates. However, Hay asked that they and Burr as well be still held on charges of treason on the possibility of some other overt act elsewhere being charged against them. This move was made by Mr. Hay at the instigation of President Jefferson. Again, the Chief Justice listened patiently through another long argument over the legal point involved. When it was over, he ruled against the request, pointing out that all of them still had to be tried before the present court on a charge of misdemeanor. Yet another protracted argument arose over the proper bail for Aaron Burr. His counsel contended that he should give none at all. Now that the colonel's neck was safe, it was no longer necessary for the Chief Justice to make every concession the defense requested. He insisted upon bail and ordered it set at $5,000. In spite of the defense's contention that no one dared perform this favor for Colonel Burr because of public opinion, two sureties at once presented themselves, and on September 8, Aaron Burr found himself a free man. For 9 weeks he had been under confinement. This being the sickly season in Washington, the president had retired to Monticello. Postmaster Gideon Granger had installed a special courier service between Washington, Richmond, and Monticello, and Secretary of State Madison's summer home, Montpelier. It was to Monticello that Hay reported to the president on the government's defeat, which he attributed to the unfriendly attitude of Judge Marshall. To show that this was not his opinion alone, he stated that Wirt, who has hitherto advocated the integrity of the Chief Justice, now abandons him. This last opinion has opened his eyes, and he speaks in the strongest terms of reprobation. Jefferson was willing enough to adopt this excuse for the failure of the prosecution. He replied at once, "Yours of the 1st came to hand yesterday. The event has been what was evidently intended from the beginning of the trial, that is to say, not only to clear Burr, but to prevent the evidence from ever going before the world. But this latter must not take place. It is now, therefore, more than ever indispensable that not a single witness be paid or permitted to depart until his testimony has been committed to writing. These whole proceedings will be laid before Congress, that they may decide whether the defect has been in the evidence of guilt, or in the law, or in the application of the law, and that they may provide the proper remedy for the past and the future." There was no doubt as to where the president believed the defect to lie. Burr had escaped conviction of treason, but in his trial on the charge of a misdemeanor there was a prospect that the witnesses who had been refused opportunity to testify by the Chief Justice would be heard. Not proved to be guilty by any evidence submitted to us, the president in his letter made it clear that Mr. Hay was to be responsible for seeing that the evidence which had been withheld reached the eyes and ears of Congress. Then Congress would know where the defect lay and provide the proper remedy. The president had abandoned the hunt for Aaron Burr. He was now hot on the trail of the Chief Justice. End of Chapter 18, read by Brian Fullen, Plano, Texas, September 2024. Section 19 of Shout Treason. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Shout Treason, The Trial of Aaron Burr by Francis F. Beirne. Chapter 19. An Act of Congress of 1794 provided that if any person should, within the jurisdiction of the United States, begin or set on foot a military expedition against the territory of any foreign power with whom the United States was at peace, he would be guilty of a high misdemeanor. It was under this statute that Burr, Blennerhassett, and their fellow conspirators were now to be tried. The specific charge against them was that they had begun or set on foot an expedition against Mexico, then a possession of Spain, with whom the United States was at peace. It was the opinion of some people that, in their effort to have Burr exonerated of the charge of treason, his counsel had virtually admitted the misdemeanor. Blennerhassett, it will be recalled, criticized one of Luther Martin's arguments for just that reason. In the few days that intervened between the two trials, Colonel Burr was making the most of his new freedom. With the beautiful Theodosia on his arm, he strolled through the town in order to give the Richmond populace full opportunity to see and admire her. The most serious crisis in her father's affairs having passed, she was on the point of returning to South Carolina with her husband and son. Blennerhassett, too, had been relieved of the ignominy of confinement behind bars. Released from the penitentiary, he went to board in town while Colonel Burr moved from Luther Martin's house to the one that had previously been occupied by the Alstons. It was not long before Blennerhassett received a visit from the colonel. According to his own account, he represented distinctly and with firmness that he expected to be repaid for all the financial losses he had suffered either through endorsing Burr's papers or buying supplies for him. And, since he was no doubt quite aware that such payment was beyond the colonel's powers, he let him know that he intended to hold Alston answerable for any losses he might have sustained over and above the amount of Alston's guarantee by letter. Both men were the objects of courtesies at the hands of the fashionable element who composed the Federalist Society in Richmond. Blennerhassett's interest in music was immediately rewarded by invitations to meetings of the Harmonic Society. Though at the outset he could not assist in the program because he had no spectacles, he was granted an honorary membership for the length of his stay in town. He found the flutes good, 4 violins moderately good, and 3 excellent singers who performed some charming trios by Dr. Calcott, inspired by extracts from Ossian. These were new to Blennerhassett's ears, and, on the whole, he enjoyed himself so much that he stayed listening to the music until midnight. The visitor was more fortunate at a meeting of the society a few nights later. Somebody lent him a pair of spectacles, thus enabling him to read notes and take part in a symphony and also in a quartet by Pleyel, but, he lamented, with less effect than if I had been provided with my own. In fact, now that Blennerhassett was free, on Sundays when the court was not sitting and in the evenings, he found many opportunities to enjoy the best Richmond society. He made a special visit to Mrs. Gamble, no doubt to thank her in person for the calf's foot jelly and butter she had sent him while he was in prison. He found her to be a most amiable old lady, so fraught with the generous humanity characteristic of her sex as to suffer not the connections of her daughters, to prevent her expressing not merely a concern for the general hardships we have suffered, but even to censure the last 2 days' proceedings in court. The connections of her daughters were, of course, Agnes's husband, Governor Cable, and Elizabeth's husband, William Wirt, who, had it not been for Hayes' nolle proseque, would at that very moment have been using his eloquence to get Blennerhassett hanged. Mrs. William Brockenbrough, too, was among the ladies expressing solicitude for the poor persecuted prisoners. The former mistress of Tuckahoe and present wife of the rising young banker was, observed Blennerhassett, the nearest approximation in Richmond to a savant bel esprit. Her reputation for intelligence was, perhaps, somewhat enhanced in Blennerhassett's estimation by her insistence that she must get a copy of The Queerest to read. The proud author of that series of articles just then was under the impression that David Robertson, who had done such a fine job of taking notes on the trial in shorthand, was going to give them a longer life by including them in the book he proposed to compile on the trial. In this expectation he proved to be mistaken. The queerest articles were not made a part of Robertson's 2 classic volumes. After his long years on his island with no settlement closer than Marietta, Blennerhassett evidently relished the cultivated society that the capital of the Commonwealth of Virginia provided. He experienced great delight in the piano performance of a talented young Frenchman. It lasted 2 hours and introduced Blennerhassett to the most recent compositions of Haydn, who, at the age of 75 years, was still producing his melodious music. At another meeting of the Harmonic Society, he enjoyed the company of Mrs. Wickham and of Mrs. Chevalier. It did not quite compensate for the separation from his wife, but the Blennerhassetts were not entirely out of touch. "I had this morning," he exulted, "a long double letter from my adored wife. Its red seal was as welcome to my eyes as the evening star to the mariner." However, these delightful diversions could not entirely erase the fact that the Messrs. Burr and Blennerhassett were in Richmond for other than social affairs. On September 9, the petty jury to hear the case of misdemeanor against the colonel was sworn in, and the trial of witnesses commenced. The trial was less than a week old when the same obstacle presented itself that had halted proceedings in the treason trial. Defense counsel again objected to what they regarded as quantities of irrelevant matter in the testimony. After the issue had been debated at length, the Chief Justice again issued one of his long and learned opinions sustaining the defense's objection. The testimony, he ruled, must include only that which showed the expedition to have been military in nature and designed against the dominions of Spain. He ruled further that the testimony must deal only with the acts charged in the indictment and which were alleged to have occurred within the jurisdiction of the court. Again, the district attorney confessed he had presented all the testimony answering the description of that which the Chief Justice had ruled to be admissible. So, like the treason trial, that on the misdemeanor charge came to an abrupt conclusion. It took the jury not more than half an hour to find Aaron Burr not guilty of a high misdemeanor. Again, as in the treason trial, on hearing the verdict, Mr. Hay entered a nolle prosequi in the cases of Blennerhassett and the other accused men. The defeat of the government was now well nigh complete. The gallant Wilkinson, observing the proceedings in Richmond, wrote a letter of condolence to his chief. "The disgraceful and dishonorable scenes which have been passing in review here are drawing to a close," he lamented. "Burr has just been acquitted on the trial for misdemeanor, and now a new motion will be made for his transmittal to Kentucky, which will go off the same way. The chief, Marshal, has stepped in too deep to retreat, and indeed his enterprise and hardihood almost justify the suspicion that he has been a party to the conspiracy." Wilkerson spoke of reforming the federal courts and getting rid of a corrupt judge. Mr. Jefferson, in a letter to a friend, took his cue from the general, remarking, "The scenes which have been acting at Richmond are sufficient to fill us with alarm. We supposed we possessed fixed laws to guard us equally against treason and oppression, but it now appears we have no law but the will of the judge." Once more it looked as though many of the government's witnesses, who had been gathered together with such great pains, and who had been waiting all these weeks to testify, would go home without being heard. But Mr. Hay had one more trump card to play. He moved that the alleged conspirators be committed both on charges of treason and misdemeanor, which might have taken place in Ohio and Mississippi. Through this motion, the Chief Justice found himself transformed into an examining magistrate. As such, he regarded it as essential that all the evidence be heard. So at last, in spite of the protests of defense counsel, the court was thrown open to any and all witnesses the government chose to present. For the most part they were youths and humble folk who had joined the expedition or had had dealings with the party on Blennerhassett Island. Edmund P. Dane. The Blennerhassets had come to his house at Belpré to buy cider. They had invited him to go on the expedition, assuring him that it was not hostile to the government and aimed only at settling the Washita lands. Israel Miller. He was with the expedition when Burr met it at the mouth of the Cumberland. He mentioned a few weapons. "Do they kill ducks and turkeys with bullets?" inquired Mr. MacRae, who was familiar only with hunting on the eastern coast. "If the gentleman had ever been in Kentucky," remarked Burr dryly, "he would have known that it was considered inglorious there to kill a squirrel or even ducks with anything but bullets." James McDowell. He went with the expedition as far as Chickasaw Bluffs, the present site of Memphis. He saw a few guns with bayonets, but no boxes of arms. It appeared to him that Mr. Burr was in command. Recalled to the stand, he admitted that after leaving the mouth of the Cumberland, he saw 6 or 7 boxes that were so heavy he could not lift them. Stephen S. Welch. He joined the party at the mouth of the Cumberland. He said the proposition put up to him was settlement of the Washita lands. Samuel Moxley and Chandler Lindsay, John Mulholland, and Hugh Allen told much the same story. "Had you any reason to suspect that any of the party meditated hostility against the United States?" inquired Burr of Allen. "Never," Allen replied. A prize witness for the prosecution was Sergeant Jacob Dunbar, a member of Captain Bissell's command at Fort Massac, when the Burr expedition passed there. Dunbar testified that Burr invited him to join the expedition and go down the river, for which purpose Captain Bissell gave him a furlough of 20 days. After the expedition had left Bayou Pierre, he said he saw Colonel Burr and another man go to the bow of the boat and set to work with an axe, auger, and saw, chopping and sawing. According to Dunbar, 2 bundles of arms tied up with cords were sunk. On being questioned, he estimated the arms at from 40 to 43 stands. He said he also saw pistols, swords, blunderbusses, fusees, and tomahawks. Dunbar testified further that, after Captain Bissell had given him leave to go with the expedition, Colonel Burr called him into his cabin and asked him if he could persuade 10 or 12 of the best men in the garrison to go along. He protested that he had repelled any such suggestion. On further questioning, it was brought out that what the sergeant meant to convey was that Colonel Burr wanted the men to desert. The reason for the alleged sinking of the arms was in order to hide them from the Mississippi authorities when they made a search of the boats. Dunbar said one man had been delegated to take out a hogshead of potatoes with which to fill an arms box to make it look like a box of potatoes. The arms, he declared, suspended by cords, were down so deep that the boat could not get to within 50 yards of the shore. Dunbar's evidence was the strongest that yet had been given to show the military aspects of the expedition, but it lost much of its force when, under cross-examination, the sergeant confessed that he had overstayed his 20-day furlough, had been arrested, and found guilty of desertion and imprisoned, and that he had written to General Wilkinson promising that if he were released he would be in New Orleans in 3 days, presumably to do the general's bidding in the trial. More impressive because of its source was the evidence of Alexander Henderson, a respected citizen of Wood County. Mr. Henderson described a visit from Mr. and Mrs. Blennerhassett, who mentioned to him the advantages to be gained by the West in separating from the Union. The Blennerhassets had remained for dinner, and after the meal was over, Harmon enlarged on the same theme in the presence of Alexander and his brother John. He told them, said Alexander, that New Orleans was to be seized, and that artillery to the number of 50 pieces belonging to the French was to be commandeered. "Did you understand whether he said anything for Mr. Jefferson?" asked Mr. Wirt, evidently with an end to refreshing the witness's memory. Alexander replied that Mr. Blennerhassett said that if Mr. Jefferson was in any way impertinent, that Colonel Burr would tie him neck and heels and throw him into the Potomac. What did he say of his means of opposition to the government? He mentioned, said Henderson, that with 3 pieces of artillery and 300 sharpshooters, he could defend any pass in the Allegheny Mountains against any force the government could send. The witness testified further that Blennerhassett had shown them 2 numbers of The Querist and told them he had written them. It is remarkable, observed Mr. Wirt, addressing the court, that Colonel Burr was at the island on the 1st of September, and the first number of The Querist is dated the 4th. John Graham, a secretary of the Mississippi Territory, who had been directed by the government in Washington to investigate Burr's activities in the West, was next called to the stand. He told of his meeting with Blennerhassett, who, with his customary gift for blundering, at first mistook him for a friend of Colonel Burr and one who was sympathetic with the expedition. Yet he admitted that Blennerhassett had mentioned the settlement of the Washita lands as being the object. Furthermore, according to Graham, when he tried to discourage him from taking part, Blennerhassett replied that the expedition was legal, that he and Burr were familiar with the law and knew what they were doing. As for the separation of the western country from the Union, he and Burr held that it would be beneficial for the people of the West, but realized that they were not yet ready for it. Saturday, September 26, was a red-letter day in the trial, since it brought 2 colorful figures to the witness stand in the persons of General Eaton and General Wilkinson. Eaton now was permitted to include in his testimony that part of his affidavit which Judge Marshall had forbidden in the treason trial on the ground that it was irrelevant to the doings on Blennerhassett Island. The evidence was sensational enough, but having been published in the newspapers throughout the country months before, it was an old story that had lost most of its original force. According to Eaton, in the course of their conversations in Washington during the winter of 1806, Burr told him that if he could win over the Marine Corps and secure the interest of Truxton, Preble, and Decatur, he would turn Congress out neck and heels, assassinate the president, or what amounted to that, and declare himself the protector of an energetic government. Eaton insisted that Burr had used such expressions as "hang him," "throw him into the Potomac," and "send him to Carter's Mountain." Carter's Mountain was that eminence overlooking the town of Charlottesville, Virginia, on whose edge lay Monticello. In response to these boasts, Eaton claimed he had observed to Burr that one solitary word would destroy him. When Burr inquired what the word was, Eaton replied, "Usurper." Burr, continued Eaton, smiled at the general's want of confidence, quoted examples of dictators from ancient history, and, if Eaton's memory served, mentioned Caesar, Cromwell, and Bonaparte. Yet who could believe Eaton, a mere adventurer who had not yet had time to spend the $10,000 indemnity presented to him by the government, so shockingly close to his appearance as its witness? Eaton's blustering and braggadocio while he was hanging around during the summer waiting his summons to testify also had created an unfavorable impression in the town. The story was spread that one disgusted Richmonder had threatened to kick the hero of Beirne out of a saloon. Nevertheless, Eaton's account of Burr's lurid boasts bore an astonishing resemblance to those the Morgans had claimed Burr had made to them, and those that Alexander Henderson had charged that Blennerhassett had made to him. Now, at last, when the proceedings were almost through, General Wilkinson was allowed to give his version of the conspiracy in open court. It was the story of Samuel Swartwout's arrival at Wilkinson's headquarters at Natchitoches with the cipher letter from Burr, and of Eric Bowman's arrival at New Orleans with the duplicate. It provided a fresh opportunity for the general to present himself to that large and attentive audience, in the role of the savior of his country. But the cross-questioning to which he was subjected by the defense made him squirm, while the explanations he gave in reply were a major test of his ingenuity. Had he made an erasure of the letter? Yes, he had erased the sentence, "Yours, postmarked 13th of May, is received." The sentence was a clear giveaway that he had been in previous communication with Burr. "Have you ever sworn that this was a true translation?" asked Mr. Botts. "No, only substantially so," was Wilkinson's reply. When the questioning drove him into a corner, he excused his conduct on the ground that at the time he had many military duties to perform in defense of his country and was in a hurry. Besides, he had been upset by the death of his wife. No doubt there was truth in that, for his devotion to her was universally acknowledged. Why, Mr. Wickham asked him, had he waited from October 10th, when Swartwout handed him the cipher letter, until October 21st to notify the government? Mr. Wickham's implication was that he had needed the time to make up his mind, but the general had a different and plausible explanation. He said he took that time in order to get out of Swartwout all the information he could about the conspiracy. Why had he asserted in his first letter to the president that he did not know the leader? Wilkinson pleaded that he was not at that time sure, since he could not fully trust what Swartwout told him. September gave way to October, and Wilkinson was still on the stand being badgered by the defense. Counsel for Colonel Burr were desirous of linking the general's high-handed conduct in New Orleans with orders issued by the government. This line of questioning brought a protest from Hay. "It has been the constant effort of the counsel on the other side to identify General Wilkinson with the government," he charged. "We have heard of the plundering of post offices, violating of oaths, and prostrating of private rights. Now it is asked if the government approved of these acts. Is it proper, is it decorous to pursue this course? Do you recollect expressing to any person that he would confer the highest obligation on the government by seizing Colonel Burr?" Wilkinson was asked by the defense. The general admitted that he might have said that, since those were his sentiments. His great object, he declared, was to apprehend Burr and deliver him to the civil power for trial. The city of Washington was the place he wished to have him sent, but personal injury to the colonel had not entered his head. He recollected a German had come to him and proffered his services to take the colonel, dead or alive. "I was shocked at the very idea," declared Wilkinson, "and declined employing him." When Mr. Wickham demanded a letter purported to have been written by President Jefferson to Wilkinson, approving the measures the general had taken, he set off another argument almost as acrimonious as that which had attended Burr's request for the subpoena duces tecum. "These gentlemen, it seems, are carrying on an impeachment against the President of the United States," asserted Mr. Wirt, not unmindful of the political effect of the charge. "What is their object in demanding this letter? It is no more than vainly to attempt to inculpate the President and to gratify their spleen and their resentment against him. Is that their object? Is Aaron Burr more or less guilty because he, the President, has approved or disapproved the measures of General Wilkinson? They want to ask you," continued Wirt, pursuing the same line of criticism, "which is the most guilty, Thomas Jefferson or Aaron Burr? Are you, then, trying the President? And even if you were, would you not have him here and give him an opportunity of answering his accusers?" "It has already been decided in this court," retorted Martin, "that the President has no more rights than the man who walks the street in rags." "What?" says the gentleman. "Will you then violate the sanctity of private correspondence? Sir, when the gentleman made this declaration, I looked at his face to see whether it did not blush with shame, and even burst with blood, at expressing such a sentiment." "I hope, sir," observed Wirt, "the redness of a man's face is no evidence of a man's guilt." This indirect allusion to Martin's own physiognomy, read presumably as a result of his addiction to the bottle, was surely not lost on the audience. The Chief Justice expressed regret that the question of producing the letter had arisen. It was irksome to him, he declared, that it was with considerable reluctance that he must insist on its being produced. He did only what his duty prescribed. However, Judge Marshall concluded, though he did not know what the letter contained, he saw no need for it to be read aloud. Now the tables were turned by the prosecution. They had contended all along that there was nothing in the letter which reflected against the President. So McRae stated that the prosecution preferred to read the letter to the court as being the only way to avert the misrepresentations of its contents. No sooner had the argument over this one letter been settled than Wickham was up again demanding that the whole of another letter from the President to Wilkinson be produced. The Chief Justice reminded him that the President had certified his reasons for communicating only certain parts of the letter. He believed that the withheld parts had no application to the present prosecution. Mr. Martin was on his feet again protesting. He hoped the court had not definitely decided the point. Once more he displayed his personal animosity toward Mr. Jefferson. Has not the court already declared that the President has no more power here than any other man? If this be law, for which gentlemen now contend, God forbid that I should remain a citizen of the United States. And is Mr. Jefferson to be the judge of the relevancy of evidence in a prosecution in which he has taken so active a part against the accused? Mr. Jefferson, sir, is a man of no legal knowledge. He was of no celebrity as a lawyer before the Revolution, and he has since been so much engaged in political pursuits that he has had time enough to unlearn the little law he ever knew. Hay rose to the defense of the President against Martin's vituperation. The only end of this conversation is abuse of Mr. Jefferson, he declared. Sir, retorted Martin, we shall use Mr. Jefferson so as not to abuse him. Remember that the life and liberty of Colonel Burr are shown to be no longer dependent on Virginians, and therefore I am free from any restraint in declaring what I think. In this scornful thrust at Virginians might be discerned a reply to Editor Ritchie's belittlement of the capacity of a certain Maryland lawyer. It now came General Wilkinson's turn to take the offensive in explaining his actions in New Orleans by presenting the warning letter dispatched by Andrew Jackson to Governor Claiborne. He also offered a deposition stating that Burr's stepson, Judge Prevost of New Orleans, had saluted a public officer there and congratulated him on the arrival of General John Adair of Kentucky as second in command to Burr. The Chief Justice ruled that it would not be correct to permit the deposition to be read. The episode nevertheless set the stage for another of Wilkinson's patriotic outbursts. Striking an attitude, he declared, I was prompted by that pure patriotism which has always influenced my conduct and my character, which I trust will never be tarnished. I shall continue to defy the utmost art, fraud, deception, and villainy that my enemies can practice toward me. Never was the general more eloquent than when he was proclaiming his virtue. The proceedings now and then were enlivened by verbal exchanges between Martin and Wirt. General Wilkinson offered a letter that Mr. Martin had requested the day before. Mr. Martin looked at it and remarked that it was only an extract. The general replied that he had no other. We take no extracts, retorted Mr. Martin, returning the paper to Wilkinson. Unless it be made of molasses, commented Wirt sotto voce. At this stage of the trial, Blennerhassett noted that Martin was more in his cups than usual. The defense counted heavily on the evidence of a Major James Bruff to discredit Wilkinson. Bruff testified that the general had held out inducements to him to join an expedition against the Spaniards. He stated that on a visit to Washington, he had called on both the Secretary of War and the Attorney General and warned them that Wilkinson was acquainted with Burr's plans and involved in them. According to his story, Secretary of War Dearborn replied that it would be impossible at this point for the government to discredit Wilkinson. The government, however, had foreseen Bruff's testimony and prepared itself to meet his charges. It had on hand as witnesses Lieutenant Edmonton Pendleton Gaines, the same Gaines who had accepted Burr's arrest, and a Commodore Shaw. These military gentlemen had traveled to Richmond in the same stagecoach with Bruff and testified that Bruff had announced in their presence that he was going to get even with General Wilkinson. Bruff had recently been sentenced by a court-martial. The testimony of Gaines and Shaw supported that of Wilkinson, who asserted that Bruff had long borne toward him an implacable hatred. In replying to Bruff's testimony, Wilkinson artfully contrived to work into his evidence damaging details of Burr's behavior at their meeting at St. Louis in the autumn of 1805, which hitherto he had been given no opportunity to present. He attributed to Burr a reference to the imbecility of the government, the prophecy that it would moulder to pieces, and his observation that the people of the western country were ready for revolt. "To this I recollect replying," said the general unctuously, "that if he had not profited more by his journey in other respects, he had better have remained at Washington or Philadelphia. For surely, said I, my friend, no person was ever more mistaken. The Western people disaffected to the government? They are bigoted to Jefferson and democracy." The general no doubt was not unmindful of how that would sound when the president got around to reading the testimony. Wilkinson concluded with a parting shot at Major Bruff. "But I can state before you, sir," addressing the Chief Justice, "and before God," turning his eyes up to heaven and placing his hands over his heart, "that this whole narrative is either a vile fabrication or a distortion of fact." After a whole week of cross-questioning, the general's spirit was unquenched, and his flair for histrionics as keen as ever. During all these tedious proceedings, the culprit, Burr, too, contrived to enjoy himself. Even though he had confessed that he had been duped, Blennerhassett still could not resist the colonel's magic charm. The two were constantly in each other's company. Blennerhassett found Burr as gay as ever and busy speculating on the reorganization of his projects, just as though they had never suffered the least interruption. He observed to the Irishman that within 6 months all their schemes would be remounted. What was more, said the colonel, they could remodel them in a better mold than formerly, since they now had a clearer view of the ground and a more perfect knowledge of men. Blennerhassett listened in silence while he thought to himself, "Time will prove him as incapable in all his future efforts as he has been in the past." The day after the jury had declared Burr not guilty of a misdemeanor, the colonel celebrated at a dinner party which included Martin, Blennerhassett, and a cousin of Judge Prevost. The dinner itself featured all the delicacies Richmond's lavish Main Street market afforded, and it included also 3 or 4 wines. "Splendid poverty!" Blennerhassett exclaimed. During the chit-chat after the cloth had been removed, a note was handed to the colonel. Blennerhassett, who sat next to him, detected the odor of musk and mentioned it. This was the cue for his host to enliven the company with a story of a flirtation. Blennerhassett gave space to it in his diary, only to convey an idea of the temperament and address which enabled this character, on certain occasions, like the snake, to cast his slough, and through age and debauchery seem to uphold his ascendancy over the sex. Yet, in spite of this caustic criticism, Blennerhassett did not cease to marvel at Burr's ingenuity. He discovered in the colonel's possession of a complete file of all the depositions made before the grand jury. "It must be confessed," he remarked, that few other men in his circumstances could have procured these documents out of the custody of offices filled by his inveterate enemies. I have long been at a loss to imagine the means he used, of which I am not yet fully informed. Burr, too, succumbed to the malady which had laid low so many people in Richmond. On one of his visits, Blennerhassett found him in bed. He suggested that a doctor be called, to which Burr replied that he had no confidence in the local physicians. Blennerhassett expressed himself as being of the same opinion, unless he accepted Dr. McClurg. That was an unwarranted reflection against some of Richmond's outstanding members of the medical profession. Blennerhassett thoughtfully went to a druggist and returned with medicine carefully prepared, which he left with the colonel. When he returned in the evening to see how his patient was faring, Burr confessed that, instead of taking Blennerhassett's medicine, he gave himself a dose of laudanum. He defended his action on the ground that he felt weak and in need of an opiate. At one of their meetings, Burr confided to Blennerhassett that as soon as the trial was over, he proposed to set off immediately for England, there to collect money for his projects. "In London, no doubt," commented Blennerhassett bitterly, "he will pledge to himself to appropriate every guinea they will advance him to the promotion of such operations on the continent as will best serve the interests of Britain. And if he had not already exposed his duplicity and incapacity to his favorite area of intrigue to Yeruho, he would again as readily promise to advance, with Spanish dollars and Spanish arms, the fortunes of the Spanish minister and his master." Toward the close of the trial, Blennerhassett had the pleasure of drinking tea and spending the evening at the Chevalier's. There he met Mrs. David Randolph, formerly the mistress of Moldavia, and the sister of a son-in-law of Jefferson. Moldavia, derived from the names of Molly and David Randolph, was Richmond's fashionable boarding-house. Mrs. Randolph was famous as a provider and the author of a cookbook. She, it will be recalled, was credited also with having designed a tin-lined ice chamber for storing perishable foods that was used as model for the first American refrigerator. Blennerhassett found her accomplished, charming in manner, and possessing a masculine mind. He recorded that, in spite of her relationship to the president, "I heard more pungent strictures upon Jefferson's head and heart, and she certainly uttered more treason than my wife ever dreamed of, for she ridiculed the experiment of a republic in this country." No wonder, since the president had deprived her husband, a Federalist, of the lucrative post of U.S. Marshal of Virginia. The last days of the trial were enlivened also by a personal encounter between General Wilkinson and young Sam Swartwout. They ran into each other on a narrow sidewalk, and the injured young man shouldered the portly Major General off into the street, uniform and all. He followed this insult with a challenge to a duel, to which Wilkinson did not reply. He would have no correspondence with traitors and conspirators, he declared. Swartwout, therefore, was reduced to publishing in the Virginia Gazette an open letter to the general, which read, "Sir, I could not have supposed that you would have completed the catalogue of your crime by adding to the guilt of treachery, forgery, and perjury the accomplishment of cowardice. Having failed in 2 different attempts to procure an interview with you, such as no gentleman of honor could refuse, I have only to pronounce and publish you to the world as a coward and poltroon." Burr's gaiety, which Blennerhassett noted, was not at all times apparent in the courtroom. As the Chief Justice began to show greater leniency toward accepting the prosecution's testimony, the colonel became progressively more bitter. He made little effort to conceal his irritation at what he conceived to be the weakness and vacillation on the part of Judge Marshall. At last the prosecution came to the end of its list of witnesses, and left to the court a decision on Hay's motion that the conspirators be held on charges of treason and misdemeanor outside the jurisdiction of the Virginia Circuit. On October 20, The Chief Justice delivered his final opinion. Weighing the whole of the testimony, he said, it appeared to him to predominate in favor of the belief that the enterprise was really designed against Mexico. If there had been any plan for dismembering the Union, it was known only to Burr and Blennerhassett. Even the witnesses offered by the prosecution had asserted that they had heard nothing and suspected nothing hostile to the United States. How, then, could the assemblage of men be said to have levied war against the United States? He therefore concluded that, in his judgment, it would be improper to commit the accused on the charge of treason. As to the charge of misdemeanor, it appeared to the Chief Justice that Burr's purposes were to settle the Washita lands and to invade Mexico if opportunity offered, perhaps only in the event of war with Spain. But this was a matter which should be left to the decision of the jury, and he would make no comment on it one way or the other to influence their judgment. He therefore would commit Burr and Blennerhassett for preparing and providing the means for a military expedition against Spain. In this instance, the misdemeanor was alleged to have occurred in Ohio. Therefore, Burr and Blennerhassett were released on bail for the action of the Circuit Court in that state at its next meeting on January 4th, 1808. Hay interpreted the decision as a defeat for the government forces. He immediately said that he would advise the government to desist from further prosecution. No man on either side had labored more indefatigably than he, but his patience was now at an end, and so in the last days of the trial he threw aside all restraint and confided in Jefferson his true sentiments with respect to Wilkinson. To the President he wrote, "The declaration which I made in court in his favor some time ago was precipitate, and though I have not retracted it, everybody sees that I have not attempted the task, which I in fact promised to perform. My confidence in him is shaken, if not destroyed. I am sorry for it, on his account, on the public account, and because you have expressed opinions in his favor. But you did not know then what you will soon know, and what I did not learn until after, long after, my declaration above mentioned." Whatever Mr. Jefferson's innermost feelings may have been on receipt of this letter from the district attorney, surely he was then in no position to confess any misgivings about the man whom he had taken as his chief ally in the proceedings in Richmond. Burr was no better pleased with the Chief Justice's decision on the Hay motion than was its author. In his disappointment at not being granted complete exoneration, he ignored the courageous behavior of Judge Marshall in his behalf at the critical moment when the mob was hot on Burr's heels. 3 days after the rendering of the final decision, he wrote in disgust to Theodosia, "After all, this is a sort of drawn battle. The Chief Justice gave his opinion on Tuesday. After declaring that there were no grounds of suspicion as to treason, he declared that Burr and Blennerhassett should give bail in $3,000 for further trial in Ohio. This opinion was a matter of regret and surprise to the friends of the Chief Justice, and of ridicule to his enemies, all believing that it was a sacrifice of principle to conciliate Jack Cade." Gratitude was not one of Colonel Burr's most conspicuous attributes. End of section 19. Read by Brian Fullen, Plano, Texas, September 2024. Section 20 of Shout Treason. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Shout Treason. The Trial of Aaron Burr by Francis F. Beirne. Chapter 20. It will be recalled that when Aaron Burr was under suspicion in the fall of 1806, he made haste to assure his friends, in no uncertain language, that there was no truth in the rumors. Senator John Smith of Ohio, who had received the colonel cordially on his visit to Cincinnati, was among the first to grow alarmed and to make direct inquiry. Burr replied that he was surprised and hurt at the unusual tenor of Smith's letter. He then went on to say, if there exists any design to separate the Western from the Eastern states, I am totally ignorant of it. I have never harbored or expressed any such intention to anyone, nor did any person ever intimate such design to me. A month later, in November, Burr addressed a letter to Governor William Henry Harrison of the Northwest Territory. Considering the various and extravagant reports which circulate concerning me, he said, it may not be unsatisfactory to you to be informed, and to you there can be no better source of information than myself, that I have no wish nor design to attempt a separation of the Union, that I have no connection with any foreign power or government, that I never meditated the introduction of any foreign power or influence into the United States or any part of its territories, but on the contrary should repel with indignation any proposition or measure having that tendency. In fine, that I have no project or views hostile to the interest or tranquillity or union of the United States or prejudicial to its government, and I pledge to you my honor for the truth of this declaration. Within the space of a few days he was assuring Henry Clay that I have no design, nor have I taken any measure, to promote a dissolution of the Union or a separation of any one or more states from the residue. I do not own a musket, nor a bayonet, nor any single article of military stores, nor does any person for me by my authority or with my knowledge. On top of all that, General Andrew Jackson was himself authority for the statement that, in reply to his inquiries, Burr had given the most sacred pledges that he had not, nor never had, any views inimical or hostile to the United States, and whenever he was charged with the intention of separating the Union, the idea of insanity must be ascribed to him. Here, then, from the lips of the accused himself were the most categorical denials of the serious charges that had been brought against him. To the truth of his assertions he pledged his honor as a gentleman. It was a pledge supported by many generations of Burrs and Edwardses, representing the purest blood of Puritan New England. Only by hair-splitting with the deliberate intention of misleading could his declarations be otherwise construed. Since then, Burr's innocence of the crimes of treason and high misdemeanor, so far as his actions within the territory of Virginia were concerned, had been attested by 2 juries of his peers in a tribunal presided over by the Chief Justice of the United States. The only mark against him that remained unresolved was his commitment by Judge Marshall for possible misdemeanor in the state of Ohio. In the light of this exoneration, the Federalists might well claim that their charge had been sustained, to wit, that Burr was an unoffending man who had been subjected to merciless political persecution at the hands of Thomas Jefferson and his followers. On the basis of the decisions rendered in Richmond, future generations might perpetuate that belief. Some 80 years were to pass before fresh evidence was disclosed touching on the activities of Aaron Burr at the turn of the century. It was on or around the year 1890 that Henry Adams, the historian, gained access to the British and Spanish archives, which contained the written reports of their representatives in this country during the administration of Thomas Jefferson. The ministers of these 2 countries were, respectively, Anthony Merry and the Marquis de Casa y Rujo. Anthony Merry came to the United States highly recommended by our minister to the Court of St. James's, Rufus King. Merry sought the office, and according to all accounts was eager to do a good job. Unfortunately for that ambition, he arrived at a time when Jefferson's ingrained antipathy toward England was at its peak. It also was at a time when the president was showing his greatest persistency in applying his theories of equality to the official society of the capital. The unhappy Mary proved to be an ideal subject on which Mr. Jefferson could practice his theories. The first opportunity came when Mr. Mary went with Secretary of State Madison to present his credentials at the White House. The traditional story is that the president received the emissary from His Majesty King George III in his bedroom slippers. Of course, there was no rule against such informality. Mr. Jefferson's indifference to dress was notorious. No slight may have been intended. Yet the British minister, wearing the full regalia of his office, was made to look somewhat foolish. He not unnaturally assumed that the author of the Declaration of Independence was being deliberately rude. That impression gained support soon thereafter when, at his official dinners, the president abolished the rules of precedence and substituted that of pell-mell, under which the company marched from the drawing-room to the dining-room in whatever order they found themselves. The system deprived the British minister of the place to which he felt entitled. It so happened that Mrs. Mary was a lady of fiery temper who rejoiced in the clash of battle. She was more eager than her husband to pick up the gauntlet Mr. Jefferson had thrown down. The result of all this was a tempest in official circles in Washington, which the critics and enemies of the president rejoiced in and did nothing to allay. Such was the unfriendly relationship between the president and the Marys when, in July of 1804, following his duel with Hamilton, Colonel Burr appeared as a refugee in Philadelphia. The Marys were spending the summer there. It was not long before the colonel, with his unerring eye for singling out malcontents in the prospect of working them into his plans, made a contact with Mary. In a letter to Lord Harrowby, then the British Foreign Secretary, dated August 4, Mary informed his superior of the details of a visit he had just received from Colonel Williamson, an emissary of Burr, whom he described as the actual Vice President of the United States, which situation he is about to resign. On that point Mary was definitely misinformed. Burr, said Mary, had made an offer through Colonel Williamson to lend his assistance to His Majesty's government in any manner in which they might think fit to employ him, particularly in endeavoring to effect a separation of the western part of the United States from that which lies between the Atlantic and the mountains. Burr's proposition, said Mary, would be fully detailed to Lord Harrowby by Williamson, who was to embark for England within a few days. Mary alluded to Burr's profligacy of character. He then sketched his existing situation, describing how he was now cast off by both the Democratic and Federalist parties, but still preserved connections with some people of influence. He called attention to Burr's great personal ambition and the spirit of revenge he harbored against the Jefferson administration. These circumstances Mary thought might possibly induce him to exert his talents and activity with fidelity to his employers. That, in substance, was Mary's first communication with his superiors on the subject of Burr. In the succeeding months Burr made his trip to the South, then returned to Washington and presided at the trial of Justice Chase before retiring from the vice presidency. Meanwhile, his friend Colonel Williamson had journeyed to England, where he held conferences with the British ministers, trying to get the cooperation of their government in Burr's plans. Burr's next contact with Mary was shortly before he set out on his first trip to the West. About this time there arrived in Washington a delegation from Louisiana to lay their grievances before the government. Under the treaty by which the territory had been ceded to the United States, its people were promised all the rights and privileges of United States citizens. But the United States government was slow in carrying out its commitments. Here was another discontented group. To Lord Harrowby on March 29, 1805, Mary directed another letter which he marked most secret. Mary mentioned that Burr had been very intimate with the Louisiana deputies during their visit to Washington. From Burr he learned that the people of that territory seemed determined to make themselves independent of the United States, and that the execution of their design was delayed only by the difficulty of obtaining previously an assurance of protection and assistance from some foreign power. Burr, according to Mary, then alluded to the possibility of the inhabitants of the western part of the United States joining in this independence movement, since Louisiana must always have command over them because of their rivers joining with the Mississippi. Burr, as usual, threw out hints without definitely committing himself. "It is clear," commented Mary, "that Mr. Burr, although he has not as yet confided to me the exact nature and extent of his plan, means to endeavor to be the instrument of effecting such a connection." Mary went on to quote Burr as saying that, for obvious reasons, the people of Louisiana would prefer having the protection and assistance of Great Britain to that of France, but that if His Majesty's government should not think proper to listen to his overture, application would be made to the government of France. Burr claimed that the French government was eager to embrace such an opportunity, and that, even while at war with England, it could find means for sending to America the small force that would be needed for the purpose. As to the military aid from the British that would be required for the enterprise, Burr, according to Mary, thought that 2 or 3 frigates and the same number of smaller vessels, stationed at the mouth of the Mississippi to prevent its being blockaded by any such force as the United States could send, and to keep open the communications with the sea, was all that would be required. Then Burr came to the vital matter of cost. Mary said Burr conceived that a loan of about £100,000 would be sufficient for the immediate purposes of the enterprise. Burr went even further to suggest a way to prevent any suspicion of His Majesty's government being involved in the transaction until the independence of Louisiana had been declared. Such suspicion would be raised if remittances were made from England to the United States, or if bills were drawn in this country. Burr knew that a payment of £200,000 was due from the United States to England in the coming July. He proposed that the British government appropriate part of this sum to his plan. If they would do that, Burr told Mary, he could devise the means to get the money into his possession without its destination being either known or suspected. Mary gave no intimation of being surprised at this proposal. If the British government had been as naive as its minister in Washington, imagine the change in Burr's declining fortune on finding himself possessed of the equivalent of approximately $500,000 out of the British treasury, and under conditions that would prevent the British government from confessing its source or protesting any purpose to which Burr might put it. Shortly after this interview, Burr set out for the West. It will be recalled that some careless talk which gave rise to rumors alarmed Daniel Clark in New Orleans and caused him to sound a warning to Burr through General Wilkinson. Mary, who by this time imagined that he was a party to the intrigue, also heard the rumors and expressed his anxiety in a letter to Lord Mulgrave, who had succeeded Harrowby in the ministry of William Pitt. He wrote, "I learn that the gentleman, Burr, has commenced his plans in the western country, and apparently with much success, although it would seem that he or some of his agents have either been indiscreet in their communication or have been betrayed by some person in whom they considered that they had reason to confide. For the object of his journey has now begun to be noted in the public prints, where it is said that a convention is to be called immediately from the states bordering on the Ohio and the Mississippi for the purpose of forming a separate government." There was a more favorable interpretation of the leak which Mary thought worth mentioning. "It is, however, possible," he said, "that the business may be so advanced as, from the nature of it, to render any further secrecy impossible." Mary concluded by noting that Burr had been received everywhere with the most marked attention. When Burr returned from his western trip in November, he lost no time in calling on the British minister. Mary faithfully reported their conversation to Lord Mulgrave in a letter dated November 25. Burr, according to Mary, opened the conversation by stating that he had supposed the British government disposed to give him assistance. "However," continued Burr, "the information he had received on this head was not sufficiently explicit to warrant his sending a confidential person to London to make the necessary communication as he had promised to do. He had, therefore, to content himself by speaking through Mary." His disappointment at the hesitation of the British government, Burr told Mary, had given him the deepest concern because his journey through the western country and Louisiana as far as New Orleans, not to speak of a visit to a part of West Florida, had been attended with so much more success than he had even looked for. Everything, he said, was completely prepared in every quarter for the execution of his plan. Therefore, he had been induced to enter into an agreement with his associates and friends to return to them in March to commence operations. Again, Burr refrained from entering into details with Mary. He thought enough had been said to start the project, and that the rest of the arrangements could be made through authorized persons he recommended to accompany the British ships. These would cruise off the mouth of the Mississippi, commencing April 10 at the latest, and continuing there until the commanding officer should receive information from him or from Daniel Clark that Louisiana had declared itself independent. Burr, according to Mary, suggested that his former estimate of naval strength needed to be increased by a number of smaller vessels, since he had learned on good authority that East and West Florida and other parts of the Spanish dominions on the North American continent were impatient for independence. Therefore, the increased British force and whatever he himself could provide would be required for this additional task. Burr mentioned no names in his conversation with Mary, contenting himself with presenting his plans in broad outline. Throughout the western country, Mary quoted him as reporting, persons of the greatest property and influence had engaged themselves to contribute very largely towards the expense of the enterprise. At New Orleans, he represented the inhabitants to be so firmly resolved upon separating themselves from their union with the United States, and every way to be so completely prepared, that he was sure the revolution there would be accomplished without a drop of blood being shed. Mary concluded with Burr's reference to Wilkinson's army. The American force in that country, should it not, as he had good reason to believe, enlist with him, not being sufficiently strong to make any opposition. It was accordingly settled that the revolution would begin at the end of the coming March or the beginning of April, provided always that the British government should consent to lend their assistance toward it, and the answer, together with the pecuniary aid which would be wanted, arrived in time to enable him to set out the beginning of March. To spur the British government to action, Burr once more threatened them with the prospect of the people of Louisiana turning to France. Then he presented another impelling argument for British help in the enterprise, though at the expense of his own loyalty to his native land. He observed, reported Mary, "What I readily conceived may happen, that when once Louisiana and the western country become independent, the eastern states will separate themselves immediately from the southern, and that thus the power which is now risen up with so much rapidity in the western hemisphere will, by such a division, be rendered at once informidable." Despite Burr's pleading and Mary's endorsement, the British government remained apathetic. The last hope of assistance from that quarter vanished when in January 1806 William Pitt died and was succeeded as Prime Minister by Charles James Fox, an avowed friend of the United States. Burr, however, had more than one string to his bow. If he could not wring money from the British, he might still try his luck with the Spaniards. The most convenient victim was Irujo, the Spanish minister. Irujo had married a daughter of Thomas McCain, signer of the Declaration of Independence and at the moment governor of Pennsylvania. He was well informed as to what was going on in the United States. As early as the summer of 1805, when Burr was in the West and the rumors were beginning to fly, he reported to Ceballos, Spanish Minister of State, "The supposed expedition against Mexico is ridiculous and chimerical in the present state of things, but I am not unaware that Burr, in order to get moneys from the English minister or from England, has made to him some proposition in which he is to play the leading role." Having thus early divined Burr's purpose of extracting money from the British, he should not have been surprised when, 6 months later, he found himself the object of financial solicitation. Burr did not personally approach Irujo. He sent as his emissary his old friend Jonathan Dayton, the ex-senator from New Jersey. The visit took place in Philadelphia, where Dayton was already present, and to which Burr repaired after his last apparently futile appeal to Mary. Dayton, according to Irujo's report to Ceballos, explained that the reason of his visit was that he had information, known only to 3 persons in the country, which he thought would be worth $30,000 or $40,000 to the Spanish government. When Irujo encouraged him to proceed, Dayton disclosed the story of Burr's secret conferences with Mary. It included the plan for taking the Floridas and for effecting the separation and independence of the western states. The Floridas, said Dayton, were to be associated with the new federated state, and for her share in bringing it about, England was to receive a preference in matters of commerce and navigation. The plan, he continued, had obtained the approval of the British minister who had recommended it to his government. Dayton added that on his trip to the West, Burr had found the people of that section not only disposed toward independence, but also anxious to make an expedition against the Kingdom of Mexico. The proposal, said Dayton, had been well received by the British cabinet. In his previous letter to Ceballos, Irujo had spoken of Burr's proposed expedition into Mexico as chimerical. Surely nothing was more chimerical than his present plan to help pay for it by frightening the Spaniards into giving him money for warning him of what was going to happen to them. General Jackson and other prominent Westerners who were enthusiastic over such an expedition and had hailed Burr as the leader no doubt would have been astonished had they known that he was thus divulging his plans to the Spaniards in the hope of getting money from them. But in this instance, Iruho was not so easily fooled. He did not believe that the British government had fallen for the plan as Dayton asserted. Iruho reasoned that, had they done so, Burr and Dayton would not now be coming to him. He was quite aware that Dayton, while pretending to betray the plot, had actually been sent by Burr. Iruho did not commit himself. He dismissed the ex-senator courteously, promising to talk to him again. Burr and Dayton appear to have realized that they had overplayed their hand. A few days later, Dayton paid a return visit. This time he confessed that Burr's plan had not been received with enthusiasm by the British ministry. Dayton now unfolded another. It was that a certain number of men were to be introduced into the city of Washington in disguise and well armed. At a signal from Burr, they were to seize the President, Vice President, and the President of the Senate, thus securing the heads of government. Next, they were to take the public money which was on deposit in the banks in Washington and Georgetown and possess themselves of the arsenal on the eastern branch of the Potomac and also the Navy Yard. The vessels would be burned except 2 or 3 which were ready for service. Burr, according to Dayton, hoped to paralyze the opposition and make favorable agreements with the individual states. But, failing this, he would board the vessels in the Navy Yard with his followers and sail for New Orleans and there proclaim the emancipation of Louisiana and the Western states. In reporting the interview to his government, Iruho observed that for one who did not know the country, it would appear almost insane. But I confess, for my part, that in view of all these circumstances, it seems to me easy to execute, although it will irritate the Atlantic states. It is beyond question that there exists in this country an infinite number of adventurers without property, full of ambition, and ready to unite at once under the standard of a revolution which promises to better their lot. Equally certain is that Burr and his friends, without discovering their true object, have succeeded in getting the goodwill of these men and inspiring the greatest confidence among them in favor of Burr. After what Mary imagined to be valiant service for his own country in abetting the dissolution of the Union, the end of his mission to the United States was distressing. His correspondence, intended for Pitt's ministers, was read by Fox, who wrote to Mary accepting his resignation. It did no good for Mary to protest that he had not offered his resignation. But even while he waited for his successor to arrive, he sent off one final dispatch warning that if Britain refused to support Burr's enterprise, recourse would be had to France, and that even without the help of any foreign power, Burr proposed to go ahead. From the foregoing evidence, various conclusions may be drawn. Apologists for Burr might question the accuracy of the reports sent to their governments by Mary and Iruho. It is hard to believe they would have made them up. Or Burr's proposals may be accepted, as Mary had at least accepted them, at their face value. If so, and had he gone on with his plans, a substantial charge of treason could be laid against Burr. Still another conclusion would be to accept Burr's own protest of innocence and to assume that the propositions he made to the British and Spanish governments were dishonest and insincere, merely designed to wring money from them for services which he never intended to perform. Whichever conclusion is accepted, had the reports of Mary and Iruho been made public at the time of the trials, one wonders whether in October 1807 Aaron Burr would have walked out of the circuit court for the 5th District of Virginia a free man. End of section 20. Read by Brian Fullen, Plano, Texas, November 2024. Section 21 of Shout Treason. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Shout Treason, The Trial of Aaron Burr by Francis F. Beirne. Chapter 21. The trial ended. Those of the principals whose homes were in Richmond returned to their normal pursuits in the city, while those from a distance departed to pick up the threads of their various careers elsewhere. What became of them in later years, and what changes were wrought in the scene of their activities during the long, hot summer of 1807, are the proper subject for a closing chapter. Richmond itself continued to grow and prosper. Its important status as capital of the state of Virginia, the seat of the administrative branch of state government, of the legislature and the judiciary, and its favorable location as a center of commerce contributed toward a continued activity of which the Burr trial was merely one outstanding episode. Prosperity had its reflections in the physical appearance of the city. As Lawyer Wickham's practice became more lucrative, and as his increasing progeny began to tax his domestic establishment, he bethought himself of building a new house. For this project he engaged the services of the distinguished young architect Robert Mills. The result of their combined efforts was the handsome house with its graceful spiral stairway, which survives to this day as the home of the Valentine Museum. Another actor in the drama, who played a modest role as a member of the grand jury, also took advantage of increasing good fortune to employ Mr. Mills to build a mansion commensurate with it. Dr. John Brockenbrough, advanced from cashier to president of the Bank of Virginia, chose a site on Shockoe Hill on an eminence with a sweeping view to the east. The new abode was a fitting setting for his wife Gabriella's salons. It has been destined to go down in history as the White House of the Confederacy. They were but two of the many other ambitious houses that altered the modest, homely face of Shockoe Hill. Even as they were rising, however, fashion was shifting westward. Within a few decades it was to sound the death knell of the hill as a desirable residential quarter. The only dwelling of distinction which stood there at the time of the Burr trial, and which stands today, is the house of Chief Justice Marshall. Restored and reverently cared for, it enables visitors to visualize what life on the hill was like when, under its roof or in the shade of the trees on the lawn, the master penned his famous opinions. The master himself and his beloved Molly have moved a few blocks away. They and their family and friends occupy more restricted quarters in Shockoe Cemetery. In death, as in life, fashion predominates. As in life, fashion moved from the hill to the West End, so in death, fashion has shifted to Hollywood Cemetery. Hollywood, with its presidents and post-bellum aristocracy, has become a showplace. Only the rare visitor finds his way through a poor and forgotten quarter to Shockoe. After his long and arduous experience presiding over the trial, the Chief Justice was in need of a rest, and he hurried off to the Blue Ridge Mountains. In a letter to his friend Judge Peter, thanking him for the gift of a book, he revealed his sense of relief. "I received it while fatigued and occupied with the most unpleasant case which has ever been brought before a judge in this or perhaps any other country, which affected to be governed by laws. In those days much of the work of the Supreme Court was conducted on circuit. So the Chief Justice was able to spend a great deal of his time on official business in the congenial atmosphere of Richmond. There, after the indignation of his political opponents over his conduct of the trial had somewhat died down, he once more enjoyed the affection and respect of his neighbors. Even after Mr. Jefferson came to the end of his term of office and retired to Monticello, the feud between the Chief Justice and himself went on. In the summer of 1821, a series of articles by Judge Spencer Rowan of the Virginia Court of Appeals attacking the Chief Justice and presenting the states' rights argument against the extension of federal power appeared in the Inquirer. In a letter to his colleague Justice Story, Judge Marshall attributed the vulgarity of their tone to Rowan, but imagined the acerbity of language increased by his communications with the great Lama of the mountains. And even when Jefferson died, the Chief Justice, kindly though he was in most human relationships, could not bring himself to the point of expressing distress or offering a word of praise. Edmund Randolph, the elder statesman, did not long survive the trial. That, in fact, was his last memorable appearance. He died in 1813 at the age of 60 years. By an irony of fate, the youngest of the counsel in the trial was the first to go. The prospects of a brilliant career were cruelly blasted when Benjamin Botts and his young wife met death in the burning of the Richmond Theater on December 26, 1811. So, save for his part in the defense of Aaron Burr, he is best known in local history as the father of John Minor Botts, a Virginia statesman. William Wirt's participation was a prelude to greater achievement. His distinction as a lawyer increased with the years, and he eventually became Attorney General of the United States in 3 administrations. Wirt combined with the law the avocation of a man of letters. He wrote a Life of Patrick Henry and a series of essays under the title of Letters of a British Spy, in which he portrayed some of his contemporaries. These publications gave him momentary fame. He was alert to seize any inspiration for a literary composition, whether it was the death of an acquaintance or an early morning stroll. Of the 2 warriors who figured in the trial, the futures were in striking contrast. Winfield Scott appeared there only as a youthful spectator. He won his spurs in the War of 1812, where he proved beyond a doubt that his natural calling was that of a soldier. Between military assignments, he occasionally returned to Richmond to pursue his courtship of the lovely and talented Maria Mayo. It was said that he wooed her as lieutenant, captain, major, and colonel, and finally as general won her hand. He eventually rose to be commander-in-chief of the United States Army, but when, in that position, he was delegated the task of invading and conquering his native state, Virginia erased his name from the list of her distinguished sons and has never restored it. The other warrior was Major General James Wilkinson. Battered and bruised from his experience at the hands of the grand jury and counsel for the defense, he returned to the Southwest to resume his command. When, in the War of 1812, General Dearborn demonstrated beyond any doubt that he was unequal to the task of commanding the United States Army of the North, the nation once more in her dire need called on the leader who, according to his own account, had saved her from the threats of Aaron Burr. Wilkinson, with the same lethargy of movement that had characterized his entry on the scene at the Burr trial, eventually reached the Northern Theater in the middle of the summer of 1813. His ensuing campaign was as disastrous to American arms as that of his predecessor had been. After a succession of failures, he gladly welcomed relief from command, though he had still to face a court-martial. This exonerated him from blame, which no doubt under the circumstances was a just decision. The nation at last seemed to have arrived at the conclusion that it could be saved without intercession of the general. He was not called on again. The remaining 12 years of life that fate generously granted him were spent in retirement in Mexico. His position there, though comfortable enough, was something less than it would have been had he appeared there as the commander of the conquering army of Emperor Aaron I. George Hay, who had battled so bravely, if unsuccessfully, for the government, eventually won his reward as a Republican stalwart. He was elevated to the bench as judge of the Federal District of Virginia. Further, to seal his connection with the Virginia dynasty, he took as his second wife Eliza, daughter of James Monroe. Hay's colleague MacRae, following his appearance as counsel for the prosecution, passed through various vicissitudes of fortune. Soon after the trial, he was appointed American consul in Paris. He remained in Europe a few years before returning to Richmond. What then happened to him is obscure. One account has it that he met with financial reverses. However that may be, he disappeared from Richmond, leaving his wife behind, and never returned. He is reported to have died in England. Of Andrew Jackson and Washington Irving, nothing needs to be said. Their later careers are too well known to require a recapitulation here. Following his release on bail to await the action of the Ohio grand jury, Colonel Burr set out for the North. He was accompanied by the ever-faithful young Samuel Swartwout, Luther Martin, and Harmon Blennerhassett. Blennerhassett's excuse was that he was sticking with the colonel in the hope of recovering more of his money. Whatever the reason, he seemed always ready to answer the colonel's beck and call and to enjoy his company, however much he might abuse him behind his back. As they proceeded on their journey, the report of the outcome of the trials in Richmond went ahead of them. It was a report of the miscarriage of justice, painted in the lurid colors of the most extreme animosity of political partisanship. The crisis came with the arrival of the party in Baltimore on November 3. That city was a hotbed of republicanism, and its frequent emotional outbursts already were conditioning it for the popular name of Mobtown. Handbills had been printed and distributed announcing the hour for the hanging in effigy of the Chief Justice, Burr, Blennerhassett, and Martin. On learning of the proposed demonstration, Burr, accompanied by Swartwout, discreetly embarked in a stagecoach for Philadelphia. Martin retired to his house, where he enjoyed the protection of some of his law students and other friends who armed themselves and prepared to resist if the house were attacked. Blennerhassett repaired to an inn where he was supposed to be guarded by the police, a doubtful security in the event of a public demonstration. At the frantic urging of the landlord, he sought the greater safety of the attic, and from a window looked down at the disorderly procession as it passed by the inn. In the lead was a fife and drum corps playing the Rogues' March. Behind it came a cart in which were the effigies of the aforesaid gentlemen on their way to be strung up on Gallows Hill. It was a motley array, which the living models for the effigies did well to escape. Fortunately, the demonstration ended without violence or bloodshed. Burr was still under indictment in New Jersey and New York, despite the fact that the death of Hamilton had occurred 3 years before. He did not therefore dare to show his face in public, but lived in New York City as a fugitive, cared for by devoted friends, until 6 months later he took passage for Europe under an assumed name. He arrived in London in the middle of July, and, because of his former distinction as well as his personal attractions, he was welcomed by such accomplished persons as Charles Lamb, William Godwin, and Jeremy Bentham. Burr was still obsessed with the idea of playing a vital part in the achievement of independence by the Spanish colonies in America. He gained an interview with the British statesmen Castlereagh and Canning and revealed a plan of action, but without obtaining either their interest or support. On the contrary, for whatever reason, the official attitude stiffened. His apartment was searched and his property seized. The property was returned, but with it came an order to leave England. Some people saw in this the avenging hand of Jefferson. Once more an exile, Burr wandered through Sweden, Denmark, and Germany, always out of funds, depending on the charity of friends, but still with enough of the old unconquerable spirit to set down in his diary a lively record of his various amours. The colonel at last reached Paris, where he sought an interview with Napoleon in the hope once more of pushing his plans for exploiting the Spanish colonies. But the emperor was too busy with his immediate problems in Europe to give ear to those of Burr. The latter's situation was more desperate than ever. The only recourse left to the outcast was to return home. The American representatives in Paris, on orders from Washington, refused him a passport. By one of those odd coincidences so often encountered in life, one of the American representatives was Alexander McRae, who so short a time before had sought his conviction in Richmond. In these trying days the colonel, if he ever needed consolation, could still count on Theodosia. In fact, the harder he was treated by the world, the greater was her adulation. It reached its climax in a letter which she addressed to him in Europe. I witness your extraordinary fortitude with new wonder at every new misfortune. Often, after reflecting on this subject, you appear to me so superior, so elevated above all other men. I contemplate you with such a strange mixture of humility, admiration, reverence, love, and pride, that very little superstition would be necessary to make me worship you as a superior being. Such enthusiasm does your character excite in me. When I afterwards revert to myself, how insignificant do my best qualities appear! My vanity would be greater if I had not been placed so near you, and yet my pride is our relationship. I had rather not live than not be the daughter of such a man. At last, in 1812, the colonel was permitted to return home. By this time public opinion even in New York had relented. The war with England and other more immediate matters served to erase from the public conscience the Hamilton episode. Burr could resume his practice, and his native brilliance soon restored him to his earlier reputation as a leader at the bar. But more tragedy was in store. This time it took the form of domestic sorrow, as though fate were trying to see what else it could do to break his indomitable spirit. From Charleston came the distressing news of the death of Aaron Burr Alston, to whom the grandfather was so devoted, and on whom he had counted to carry on the family tradition. There was still more to come. Theodosia, stricken with grief and herself fatally ill, sought solace in the company of her father in New York. At noon on December 30, 1812, accompanied by her maid, she set sail from Charleston aboard a vessel named the Patriot. Not long after, a terrific storm blew up on the Atlantic. The Patriot was never heard of again. The vessel's fate has continued to be a mystery. The North Carolina coast in the neighborhood of Cape Hatteras was notorious in those days for wreckers, men who, by the ingenious shifting of lights on shore, lured ships on the shoals and, when the ships had broken up, preyed on the wrecks. There were as well rumors of the operations of pirates. In later years, legends sprang up of deathbed confessions in which Theodosia Burr Alston figured as a victim of one of these bands of marauders. But convincing proof is lacking. Whatever his innermost thoughts, Burr accepted this last and bitterest loss with the stoicism he had shown on earlier occasions. His pride demanded that he do no less. Meanwhile, retribution had caught up with another figure in the trial. Luther Martin's constitution broke down under his persistent and unrestricted drinking. His law practice fell away. Burr learned of his condition and repaid him for past favors by giving him asylum in his home in New York. Eventually Martin returned to Baltimore, his once brilliant mind shattered by the steady inroads of senility. He often wandered through the courtrooms which had been the scene of so many of his triumphs, a drooling derelict for whose support, in recognition of his great past achievements, each member of the bar accepted a small annual assessment. Shortly after the episode in Baltimore, Blennerhassett parted company with Burr and went to join his beloved Margaret in Natchez. He was now approaching the end of his resources, burdened with an accumulation of debts and badgered by insolent and exacting creditors. His library, research apparatus, and the furniture in the mansion on the island had to be sold. The mansion itself was allowed to go to ruin. It was taken over along with the rest of the island by a tenant who used them for the culture of hemp and the manufacture of cordage. It was not long, however, before the mansion was mercifully rescued from its humiliation by a fire which leveled it to the ground. Despairing of ever getting any money out of Burr, Blennerhassett concentrated on his son-in-law Alston, demanding $35,000 on pain of publishing a pamphlet disclosing the governor's connection with the conspiracy. Alston, now governor of South Carolina, is reported to have given him $10,000. Blennerhassett's next venture was the purchase of a cotton plantation in Mississippi. In spite of Margaret's loyal support, this too was a failure. At this point the acting governor of Canada, an old and intimate friend, managed to find a seat for Blennerhassett on one of the provincial courts of the Dominion. So in 1819, disposing of what interest remained to him in the island and the plantation, he moved with his wife and sons to Canada and took up his residence in Montreal. But this solution of his problem proved temporary. He was turned out of office by what he described as the capriciousness of the British ministry. All that was left to him now were claims to property still existing in Ireland. So, in 1822, the Blennerhassetts set sail from Canada for home. Nothing came of the claims, and, after living for a time with a maiden sister of Harmon's in England, the Blennerhassetts sought refuge on the island of Guernsey. That was Blennerhassett's last move. There he died in 1831, leaving Margaret with little or no money and 2 dependent sons. In 1842, Mrs. Blennerhassett decided to return to the United States and petitioned Congress for payment for the boats and stores seized at Marietta, Ohio, in the winter of 1806-07. On her arrival in New York with one of her sons, Henry Clay, who was then in the Senate, interested himself in her case. He described her as living in absolute want, presented her petition, and advocated its justice. But the petitioner died before the Senate had time to act. Thus ended the tragic story of the Blennerhassetts, though they themselves may not have considered it so. For the love that had been the cause of their adventures in the New World sustained them to the last. Yet their later years were a far cry from the romantic dreams in which Blennerhassett stood at the right hand of the Emperor Aaron I, while Margaret presided as First Lady-in-Waiting to the Princess Theodosia. Such was the heavy penalty the Blennerhassetts had to pay for Harmon, as his partner Woodbridge put it, having all kinds of sense except common sense. For some 15 years, Aaron Burr continued to practice law in New York City successfully. At the age of 77 years, he had one last romantic passage, which culminated in his marriage to the widow Jumel, for which nothing good could be said on either side. The episode soon ended in divorce. Time for the colonel was now fast running out. Yet how many of his enemies had he already survived? Death came to him at last in September 1836, at the age of 80 years. The body of Aaron Burr was laid to rest in a grave beside those of his father and his grandfather in the cemetery at Princeton. One evening at twilight many years later, 2 visitors stood at the foot of the grave. Instinctively, both of them had removed their hats as they approached the spot. They were Burr's biographer, Walter Flavius McCaleb, and Woodrow Wilson, then president of Princeton University. They remained for a moment in silence. It was broken by Wilson's voice, pitched very low. How misunderstood, how maligned. This from a historian who must have been acquainted with all the facts. Even in death, and in spite of the passage of time, Aaron Burr still exercised his fascination. End of section 21. Read by Brian Fullen, Plano, Texas, September 2024. End of Shout Treason, The Trial of Aaron Burr by Francis F. Beirne.